Can you believe that I've been making Name Explain for over 3 years and I haven't even looked at the etymology of France? I live in the southeast coast of England. I can pretty much see the country from my window. And of course France is a spectacular country with a deep and amazing history full of interesting characters. And it's the most visited country in the world. People flock to the nation to see its amazing cities, mountains, beaches, ski resorts. France has it all. So to make up for this lack of acknowledging France for all these years, let's make up for it by not only looking into how France got its name, but how the nation's many regions ended up with their names too. So first off, let's look into how France itself got its name. France is actually a name that I covered in my book, The Origin of Names, Words and Everything in Between, which is now available from Amazon, hint hint. Like many countries, France is believed to be named after the people who lived there, the people in this case being the Franks, a Germanic people who took over the land. France's Latin name is Francia, which means the country of the Franks. How the Franks got their name, however, is a bit more confusing. The popular idea is that the Franks got their names from a specific type of weapon they were known for using, a throwing axe called a francisca. However, more recent evidence points to the weapon being named after the people and not vice versa. It's more believed now that the Franks are named after the Old English franca, which means free, as the Franks lived tax-free after they conquered Gaul. This etymology also makes the term to be frank make much more sense, as when you say to be frank, it means you are speaking freely. So that's how France got its name, but this video is about way more than just France. It's about looking deeper into the regions of France too. France is currently split into 12 regions on its mainland and an island just off its coast in the Mediterranean. France does have overseas territories, but it's just these 13 we'll be looking into today. However, this has only very recently become the case. There used to be 22 regions on mainland France, but since the 1st of January 2016, these 22 regions were merged into just 12, some gaining completely new names, some kept their own names, and others were given names compiled from their previous names. Like I said, it's these new regions we will be focusing on, but I will say what the previous regions were called and look into a few interesting ones with names that might ring a bell, and a big apology for pronunciation going forward. I can barely say English words, let alone French words. Hopefully if future Patrick remembers to do so, my pronunciation sources will be in the description down below. The northernmost region of France is Hauts-de-France, which is made up of the former regions of Nord-Pas-de-Calais and Picardy. This name means Upper France, which makes sense considering that this region is the furthest northern point in France. Normandy is a region of France that didn't change massively in 2016. It simply combined Upper and Lower Normandy together. This name comes from the people who settled in the land, mainly Danish and Norwegian Vikings. They were known as the Northmen/Norsemen as they came from the north, and over time this became the Norman and their land became Normandy. Île-de-France is the most populated region in France, and that's due to it containing the country's capital, Paris. Due to this, the region is also known as Région Parisienne, which means Paris region. Of course, that isn't its actual name. Île-de-France means Island of France, which is weird considering the region is completely landlocked. This name apparently derives from the fact that the region is bordered by rivers, what surrounds it somewhat like an island. Glandes is a pretty obvious name for us to understand. It's pretty big and grand and is located in the east of France. Originally it was made up of the regions of Alsace, Champagne-Ardenne and Lorraine. It's that region of Champagne-Ardenne that sticks out to me, however, especially the former part of its name, Champagne, which in itself is a historic region of France. The sparkling wine drunk around the world is named after this region. Brittany wasn't affected by the changing of the French regions in 2016. This name sounds so similar to the island nearby due to it being named after the Britons who settled on the land. I covered this in detail in my Names of Celtic Britain video. Just below and next to Brittany is Pays de la Loire, which like Brittany wasn't broken up or changed in the French region reformation of 2016. The first part of this name means country of the in French, with the Loire being the longest river in France and the river that goes straight through this region. The name for this river is thought to come from the Latin liga, which is thought to come from the older Proto-Indo-European root for words like mud and water. The Loire River's name appears once more in the region next to Pays de la Loire, Centre-Val de Loire, which simply means that the region is in the centre of the Loire Valley. This region too was not changed in any way in 2016. Below the Grand Est region, we have the region of Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, its name being a combination of the regions that formed it, Burgundy and Franche-Comté. Burgundy is an interesting name, I find, and not only is it the name of a previous French region, it's also the name of a dark reddish purple colour. Like champagne, we have alcohol to thank for this, as the name for the colour Burgundy comes from the dark red Burgundy wine produced in Burgundy. And of course, it's the surname of the finest journalist our world has been blessed with. The region of Nouvelle-Aquitaine was formed of the regions of Limousin, Poitou-Charentes and Aquitaine. It's from this last region where the name comes from, as Nouvelle-Aquitaine means New Aquitaine. This name is thought to come from the Latin Aquitania, meaning waterland, as its western border is next to the Bay of Biscay. What struck me as interesting here is the previous Limousin region. A type of hood worn by the people in this region reminded people of a profile of a certain long fancy car, so those cars became known as limousines. Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes name too quite simply comes from the regions that created it, Auvergne and Rhône-Alpes. The name Auvergne comes from Auvergne, a Celtic tribe who once lived in the land. The Rhône-Alpes name comes from two geographic features, the Rhône River and Alps mountain range. The region of Occitanie is made up of the former regions of Languedoc-Roussillon and Midi-Pyrénées. Instead of just combining these names together, the name of Occitanie was used. This name comes from the historic region of Occitania, which resided in the south of France. The last mainland region seems to have two names, its long name of Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur and its shorter name of Région du Sud. This latter name is easier to understand, meaning simply the south region due to its location. This longer name comes from a combination of factors, it would seem. The region shares a lot of its borders with the previous French province of Provence. It's by the Alps and contains the Côte d'Azur. This last name I find particularly beautiful. It means coast of Azure and comes from the beautiful azure coloured oceans that grace it. Finally, we have the island of Corsica, an island region in the heart of the Mediterranean and a birthplace of a certain emperor. Unfortunately, we don't seem to know where this name comes from. It comes from the Greek Corsis, but after that we are clueless. It is home to plenty of rolling green hills, and the other is home to, let's just say, copious amounts of ice. So you would think that the one with a lot of ice would be called Iceland, and the one with a lot of green would be called Greenland, right? Well, for some reason these two nations would seem to have the wrong names, with the greener one called Iceland and the icy one called Greenland. The whole Iceland-Greenland debacle has been talked about on the internet for many years now. Like, look how archaic these memes are about it. But surely there has to be more to it. First, let's look at Iceland's name. Something interesting about the naming conventions of the Norse is that they tended to name places after what they saw there. This can be seen with a portion of Canada that was known as Vineland when Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, who we'll be talking about a little bit later, saw wild grapes and blackberries growing on vines there. And of course it was this logic that went into the naming of Iceland too, as we see in the Icelandic sagas. There's actually a couple ideas as to where Iceland got its name from. One of the first names that we hear of for the country in the Icelandic sagas is Snæland, meaning snowland, as it was snowing when Nadadal, the first Norse explorer, reached Iceland. Another popular theory of how the country was named was due to Nordic settlers giving it that name as they wanted to discourage as many people as possible from also settling the island and overcrowding it. And with the current population of Iceland, I can kinda see that logic. Yet perhaps the most popular theory of how Iceland got its name is thanks to the Norwegian Viking Flokus Vilgalosson. According to the Icelandic Book of Settlement, the story goes that he, his family and what livestock they could load onto the boat set sail to find lands that had been reported on by explorers before him. His daughter unfortunately drowned in the travels, and one of the things he was perhaps most famous for were his 3 ravens. He used these ravens to find new lands for him. The first of his ravens flew towards the already discovered Faroe Islands. The second flew into the air before coming back to the boat, but the last raven flew away, leading Flokus to the coast of Iceland and earning his name Hrafna Flokus, meaning Raven Flokus. Yet once there, Flokus didn't have the best time on the island. With his daughter dying during the journey, all the livestock he took with him perished in the harsh winter. The saga tells us that depressed and frustrated, he climbed a mountain to discover a fjord full of icebergs. He named this island Iceland because of this, and that was the name that made its way around the Viking world and stuck to this day. As the years went on since Flokus's naming of the land, Iceland grew and became more populated, eventually becoming the home of Norwegian-born Icelandic Viking Eric the Red. Eric wasn't the best of people, to say the least. Thought to be born in 950 CE, his father was exiled for manslaughter when he was just 10 years old. Eric grew up an angry young man. This anger, plus his red hair and beard, is what led to him becoming known as Eric the Red. By 982 CE, Eric was banished from Iceland due to killing 3 people in a feud. He took this time banished from Iceland to search for a new land that had been rumoured to exist west of Iceland. Eric found this land and decided to call it Greenland, hoping this name and the idea of a luscious land of vegetation and greenery would entice more people to come and live there too. So there we have it, one named by a Viking out of despair in the depths of winter, and the other named by another Viking as basically a marketing campaign. Yet even though these names at first glance look like they should be the other way around, perhaps there is more to it than that. Though Greenland is undoubtedly covered in ice, back when Eric first settled in the land in the summer of 982 CE, the grass may have been a lot greener, especially as he arrived in the south of the island, which even to today is one of the greener parts of Greenland. While Iceland is definitely the greener of the two countries, especially in the summer months, the country itself can still become extremely snow laden in the winter months when even the mighty Gullfoss waterfall can freeze. It's thought that at least 11% of the country is permanently covered in ice, and Iceland is home to Europe's largest glacier, so perhaps the names aren't quite as mixed up as it would initially seem for these two Nordic countries. Norway is the home of many things. It is the home of the paperclip, the scream, and of course the Vikings. But how did this Nordic nation get its name? Norway in Norwegian actually has a couple names. Norwegian is a pretty interesting language because when written it has two different forms, bokmål and nynorsk. From what I can gather, these two written forms of Norwegian can be used pretty interchangeably, though bokmål is far more popular. Bokmål is based on written Danish and means book language, while nynorsk means New Norse and was based on all the dialects of the country. But anyway, in bokmål the country is called Norge, and in nynorsk it is called Noreg. Yep, these two variations, and the main difference in the name is that two letters are the opposite ways round. Yet these two names and its English name of Norway all come from the same word, and forgive me as I have no idea how to pronounce these. Initially the name came from the Old Norse Novgern, which turned into the Old English Northweg. While it may not be as obvious as say the country of South Africa, Norway is named after its location. It's just not called something as obvious as North Europe or anything. The name translates to something along the lines of North Way, or a way leading to the north, as the land was northern to the Anglo-Saxons, and this is how they refer to the western coastline of the country. Somewhat of interest in the naming of Norway is Ofela. We know very little of this man, and the only thing we have to prove his existence come from his travel writings, which were given to King Alfred of Wessex in around 890 CE. Ofela was a Viking seafarer and is even sometimes referred to as the first North Norwegian man, as some big archaeological findings have found evidence that he could have resided in the north of Norway, and that in his writings he said he lived northmost of all the Norwegians. Yet regardless of where he lived, he is important to this story, as the writings the King of Wessex received from him explaining that he lived northmost of all the Norwegians is our earliest known written source of the name Norway. Yet there's also a second theory as to how Norway got its name, and that's that the Nor in its name doesn't mean north, but rather it means narrow in relation to the narrow waterways and fjords of the country. I mean, personally looking at it, the country itself is pretty narrow, and the country is pretty northern. While the north etymology is the traditional long-standing idea, and this narrow etymology is the new upstart idea, there is definitely a valid argument for both of these ideas as to where the country of Norway got its name. When I think of Celtic places, the lands of Scotland, Ireland, and even the Isle of Man come to mind. To me, these places are quintessentially Celtic. However, maybe that's just me being uninformed, or even me only knowing things about the Celts that I've learned from television and movies depicting them. The fact of the matter is that Celtic tribes lived all across Europe, not just in the British Isles as we often think of them as, though maybe that's just me. With perhaps the most interesting of all of these being the sun-drenched nation of Portugal. Now, Portugal is a country I wouldn't really think of as being Celtic, yet the nation has a huge Celtic influence, with of course the name of the nation itself coming from a Celtic origin. Now, I always thought that the Celtic tribes originated from the British Isles and worked their way around Europe. However, this doesn't seem to be the case at all. We don't seem to know for sure the exact birthplace of the Celts, but one source seems to point to the area of modern Switzerland and Austria as being the place the Celts originated from. The Celt tribe who ended up in Portugal were the Galaki, who settled in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, which now consists of the most northern part of Portugal and the northwestern region of Spain named Galicia. So I'm sure you can understand how that region of Spain ended up with that name. As we know, it's so often that places get named after the people who settled there, and we can see that clearly with the Spanish region of Galicia and the Celts who lived there, the Galaki. So why isn't Portugal named this too? Well, while we have the Galaki Celts to thank for the name of Portugal, the country isn't named after them directly. Lots of settlements in Portugal have names that have roots in the Celts who roamed the country, especially in the north of Portugal. One of these being the settlement of Cali. Cali was a prosperous port city at the mouth of the Douro River. The etymology of Cali isn't really known to us either. It's thought to possibly come from a Greek word which means beautiful, as that part of the world is very beautiful indeed. However, others feel the name may come from Celtic origins like Cali or Cala, which means things like port, harbour or inlet. However, just Calais didn't stay its name for too long, when the Romans took over the land around 200 BC during the Second Punic War, which also kind of led to the naming of mayonnaise. When the Romans took over the land, they added a name to this settlement. Due to it being a port, they added their Latin word for port to the front of its name, naming it Portus Calais, which means if the Calais part of this name does mean port, then this name could mean port. Nevertheless, it was this name of Portus Calais that caught on in the town, and not just in the town, but the name spread across the entire land. This name of Portus Calais became Portugal, which turned into Portugale, which finally became the name we know today, not just for this town, but for the entire country, Portugal. However, if you look at a modern map of Portugal, you won't find Calais or Portus Calais anywhere, and that's because the city of Portus Calais ended up chopping off the part of its name that started it all. With the Calais part of its name gone, the city of just Porto now stands in its place. Are broken into continents, and from there they're broken into countries, then regions, then towns, then streets, then, well, you get the idea. However, in some parts of the world there's another way land is broken up, somewhere between continents and countries, and these were various collections of lands that have been given their own names. Europe is littered with places like this. We have Scandinavia, which consists of the countries of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, and the Baltic, which is made up of the nations of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. However, these are all quite cold places, so let's look for a collection of countries in Europe that have a much sunnier disposition. And of course, that brings us neatly to the topic of today's video, the Iberian Peninsula, or as it's more commonly known as, Iberia. Iberia is the mass of land you'll find just south of France. In fact, tiny portions of France are considered to actually be in Iberia, but we aren't going to be looking into those today. Of course, there are primarily two nations that call Iberia their home, Spain and Portugal. However, that isn't all. There's also the microstate of Andorra tucked away between Spain and France, and it's obviously home to the always sunny, totally definitely Iberian nation of the United Kingdom. Well, kind of. In the south of Spain lies Gibraltar, which is in fact a British overseas territory. If you cast your mind back to December 2018, you may remember my Names of Scandinavia Explained video, where we looked into the nations of Scandinavia and how they and their biggest cities got their names. Well, today it's the names of Iberia's turn to get explained. So let's look into the names of Spain, Portugal, Andorra, Gibraltar and their capital cities, as well as some bonus bits I want to bring up. However, before we look into any of these names, we need to look into the name Iberia itself. This name comes from the time of ancient Greece and Rome, where there were different names in the different languages. It seems that the name Iberia is of Greek origin, coming from the name Hybelia. I read that this name could come from a couple different places, either coming from the Greek Iberus, which was their name for the group of people living in ancient Spain, or the river Ebro that flows through Spain. It's thought that the name of this river could come from the Basque word Iba or Ibar, which means river and valley respectively. The Latin name for this land, however, was Hispania, which is a name we'll cover shortly when talking about the largest nation of modern day Hispania. Though it's also interesting to note that there was another Iberia on our planet, one that was in what is now modern Georgia, which was known as the Kingdom of Iberia to the Greeks and Romans. Why this Iberia had the same name as the other Iberia, however, I'm not too sure. And while not called Iberia, a name that is somewhat similar to Iberia is Ibiza. However, despite their similarities, these names aren't related. I read that this name comes from the Arabic word Yabasa, meaning land, and the island's Catalan name, Ibiza. Like I said, it's just a coincidence. So let's look into the nations of Iberia, starting with the biggest nation of Iberia, Spain. As I mentioned, the Romans called Iberia in Latin Hispania, and it's from this name that Spain and the Spanish name for Spain, España, come from. However, where this initial name of Hispania comes from is all kinds of confusing. Spain is a nation with a rich history and with an empire that claimed a huge amount of land. It's safe to say that a nation as powerful and awesome as Spain should only really be named after something equally awesome and powerful. So what is it named after? Well, rabbits. Yeah, the cute things with the floppy ears that bounce around. They aren't quite the powerful thing I had in mind. And it's also only thought to be named after rabbits by some really weird turnabout way. We don't actually know the true etymology of Hispania for sure. This name apparently comes from the Phoenicians, who when they came to the land noticed the rabbits that were living there. The rabbits reminded the Phoenicians of the hyraxes they have in their homeland. And also the Phoenicians would have had to sail there, so without knowing any better, they thought this rabbit-filled land was an an island, so they went with the name Hispania, which means Isle of Hyraxes, despite the fact it wasn't an island and it wasn't full of Hyraxes. Like I said, this is just one idea of how the name came to be. Other ideas range from it being named after the mythological character of Hispan, to it coming from ancient words for distant and far. It's one of those names we just don't really know for sure, but in all honesty I really like the rabbit idea, just because of how cute rabbits are. Spain's capital city of Madrid has too got a just as ambiguous etymology. We don't have one definitive idea as to how the name Madrid came to be, but we have a few ideas. Most of these theories however relate to water, I guess in reference to the river that runs through Madrid, the Manzanares. It's thought to have possibly evolved from the Roman matris, which meant water. However, the more popular idea seems to stem from the Moors, the Muslim inhabitants of Iberia in the 8th century. They named the aforementioned river Al-Maglit, which meant water source in Arabic. In turn, the surrounding area of this river was called a Melit, which comes from another Arabic term meaning water, and from here it's thought the name Malit evolved into Madrid as we know it today, though not all theories are water based. One idea is that the city was founded by the son of a Tuscan king whose wife was called Mantua. He named the city after his wife, and then the name Mantua evolved into Madrid. Personally, I prefer the water ideas. And before we leave Spain behind, I want to throw in this bonus fact. I was looking for a famous thing from Spain and found out that the lollipops Chupa Chups are Spanish. So I looked into them and found out this fun name comes from the Spanish verb chupar, which means to suck, which is logical enough as there isn't much else you do with a lollipop. However, the really fun part is their logo, which was designed by none other than Salvador Dali, which probably makes this his most seen work of art. Soz persistence of memory. Moving away from Spain, we have the nation of Portugal, which I've actually covered in a video all to itself, so please do consider checking that out. However, I'm happy to cover it here again as it's actually one of my favourite nation name origins, and that's because the name comes from a blend of two different languages. Most names and words usually originate from one language and then evolve over languages, but to see two languages come together to form one name is really cool. Well, I find it cool at least. Anyway, what languages went into the naming of Portugal? Well, it was none other than the two ancient languages of Celtic and Latin. At first, it was Celtic people who lived in this land, and they had a settlement called Calais. It's thought that this name might come from the Celtic Calais or Cala, which means port/harbour, as the city of Calais was in fact a harbourside town. Yet of course, as with most things in Europe, the Romans took over, and when they did, they added the Latin word for port, Porto, to the front of the name, dubbing the city Porto Calais. This name of Porto Calais, that came into being from a Latin word and a Celtic word, eventually came together to create the whole new word of Porto Calais, which eventually became the name for not just this city but the nation as a whole, and evolved into the name Portugal we have today. There's just something so nice about this etymology. It reminds me of mixing paints, taking these two very separate things but then mixing them together to create a brand new thing. I don't know, maybe I'm just rambling on now. And that initial city of Porto Calais is still with us. However, it's since chopped off the Calais part of his name and is now just going by Porto. However, this isn't the capital of Portugal. That honour goes to the city of Lisbon. There's actually a pretty popular legend for how this name of the city came to be. This legend goes that it was named by the Greek legendary hero Ulysses. He apparently dubbed it Ulyssipio or Olysipio, which is thought to come from the Phoenician Alis Opo, meaning enchanting port. However, like I said, this is just a legend and probably not true. Wikipedia states it more likely came from ancient Proto-Celtic root like Lysipio. Next up, we have tiny little Andorra, and believe me, it's tiny. It covers 181 square miles and has a population of under 80,000. For being such a tiny state nestled between France and Spain, it makes you think, why isn't Andorra just a part of either of these nations? The legend goes that it was actually Charlemagne, the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who set up the borders of Andorra after helping the people of the land defend themselves, and since that ancient time Andorra has remained an independent nation. Though from what I've read, they have a lot of influence from France, Spain and even Portugal, with those three languages being spoken there. However, Catalan is their official language, making it the only country with Catalan as their official language. Well, until the whole Catalonia dependency thing pans out and makes this video outdated, but I'm nowhere near qualified enough to talk about that. But I'm sure there will be a lively debate about Catalonia independence down in the comments, so go enjoy that. However, we aren't too sure on where this name came from. There are a few ideas and all seem to relate to the geography of Andorra. The earliest mention of the name in any capacity comes from Greek historian and philosopher Polybius, who referred to a tribe who lived in these lands as the Andosins. The most popular idea is that the name comes from the native language word Andulil, which means the land of scrubland and bushes, which I can see, I guess. I mean, I haven't been there myself, but from looking at pictures I see ample scrubland and bushes. Another theory on the origin of the name is that it comes from the time Muslims ruled Iberia, coming from the Arabic phrase al-Adura, which means the forest. Like I said, whichever one is correct, the name has very natural origins. Andorra's capital, however, has a name that isn't anywhere near as confusing to understand, with it being called Andorra la Vella, which simply means Andorra the town. This helped differentiate itself from the country as a whole. This is actually quite a common trait in these tiny European countries. The capital of Luxembourg is called Luxembourg City, and the capital of San Marino is simply called the city of San Marino. And finally we have Gibraltar, which like we mentioned isn't actually a country unto itself but a British overseas dependency. Unsurprisingly, Gibraltar was originally owned by the Spanish. However, in a war in 1704 it was captured by the British, with it officially becoming property of the British in 1713 under the Treaty of Utrecht. This treaty even stated that Gibraltar was to be held and enjoyed forever by the British without any exception. However, that hasn't stopped attempts to reclaim the rock, though from what I could tell it still seems hotly debated whether the British should return the rock to the Spanish. That's something you guys can discuss down below. Unlike pretty much everywhere else we've talked about today, we actually seem to know quite definitively where the name Gibraltar comes from. It was once again named by the Muslim Moors of Iberia, who gave it the name Jebel et Talik, which means a mountain of Talik, with Talik being one of the Moor leaders. With this rock being taken over by the English, this name was anglicised to the Gibraltar we have to this day. And as for the capital of Gibraltar, well, it's not really the capital, but we have West Side, which is named because, and you guessed it, it is on the west side of the rock. Before we head off, there's one other fun etymological fact I'd love to share about Gibraltar, and that's the idea that the name of Gibraltar helped in the creation of another word. The story goes that the people who lived there spoke an interesting mix of English, Spanish, Arabic, and other languages. Outsiders wouldn't be able to understand them. It sounded like the people of Gibraltar were talking gibberish. A word that some think has Gibraltar to thank for its existence. In Northern Europe, we have a region of the world known as Scandinavia, which consists primarily of 3 countries. There's a whole conversation for what is and isn't Scandinavian, but that's already been covered. So for now, we're going to look at just the 3 countries that definitely are Scandinavian: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Think of this as a big Scandinavian special. Not only are we going to look at how these countries got their names, but also look at how their capital cities got their names, and how a famous thing from each of these countries got their names. This last section is solely here to give me an excuse to talk about Lego. And of course, we're going to be looking at the name for these countries as a whole, Scandinavia. This name is believed to come from the Old Norse Skane, which is the name for the southernmost tip of modern day Sweden. This was initially believed to be an island at first, and perhaps at one point in history it was an island, so the name is believed in turn to come from this Proto-Germanic word, with the first part of the name being unknown but the second part being thing on the water, which fits with the island idea. This part of the world was known to the Romans as Scania or Skjolna, and from this one part of Sweden the name Scandinavia evolved and took over that whole part of the world. Some even feel the name is related to the Norse goddess Skadi, though this is still up for debate. And I might be saying up for debate a few more times in this video. Scandinavia is a seriously ancient part of the world, and a lot of these etymologies aren't too clear to us. I'll do my best to figure out where these names come from, but sometimes we might hit something of an etymological dead end. We've actually done a whole video on the name Norway in the past, but nevertheless no harm in covering it here too. The name Norway relates to its location on the planet, that being in the north, with the name believed to mean North Way or a way leading to the north, as it was northern to the Anglo-Saxons, with this coming from the Old Norse Norveg, which turned into the Old English Northweg and eventually into Norway. The capital of Norway is the city of Oslo. The city of Oslo has actually gone by a variety of names, it would seem. The current name of Oslo is apparently based on the Old Norse Os, which means estuary/river mouth, referencing the city's location, but Oslo hasn't always been called Oslo. Well, it was initially and it is again now, but between then and now the name of the city was changed to Christiania. The original town of Oslo actually burnt down in a fire. King Christian IV decided to rebuild the town in a new location and rename it after himself. How very humble. But eventually this new location for the town went by the old name of Oslo once again. Perhaps the one thing Norway is most popular for is its beautiful fjords. Though fjords are found across the world, they are perhaps most well known in Norway, and the word itself is Norwegian, coming from an Old Norse word which means inlet/estuary. The most populated country of all 3 Scandinavian countries countries is Sweden. Now Sweden really doesn't have a clear etymology to us. It seems to be generally agreed upon that the name comes from the inhabitants of the land, the Swedes. What's interesting is that the name Sweden as we know it in the English language comes from the Scottish with their words for the name like Swiffen and Swadne, and funnily enough it came to the Scottish from the Middle Dutch Sweden. So if Sweden is named after its inhabitants, the Swedes, then how on earth did they get their names? It's believed to come from the Proto-Germanic Swabna, which means free/independent, so I guess Sweden could also be seen as the land of the free too. A name that seems to be somewhat more clear for us to understand is the name of Sweden's capital city, Stockholm. The name is believed to come from a combination of two Swedish words, Stocka, which means log/pole, and holm, which means island/islet, so we could say Stockholm means log island. The island part of this name makes sense as the city is placed over islands, but why logs? There's a few ideas as to why it was named after logs, from using logs as markers in the city, the huge amounts of logs and stumps on the oldest islands of the city, to logs blocking ship routes so fees could be implemented. And of course, if we have to look at how a popular Swedish thing got their name, we have to look at the home of flat pack furniture with IKEA. Luckily for us, IKEA isn't some old Norse word, but it's actually an acronym coming from the founder's name, Ingvar Kamprad, Ilmutjolid, the farm he grew up in, and Argi Unalid, the village he grew up in. And finally, we have the country of Denmark. Like Sweden, the name Denmark comes from the people who inhabited the land, the Danes, and the mark part comes from the Danish mark, which means border, which means it's the land bordered by the Danes. So what about their capital, Copenhagen? Like Stockholm's name, this comes from a compound of two words, but obviously Danish words this time, not Swedish words. In Danish, the city is called Copenhagen, which comes from the Danish korba, meaning merchant, and Danish haven, which means port, meaning Copenhagen means the merchant's port. And of course, like I said at the start of the video, we have to take a look at a famous Danish thing, which of course has to be a product which is one of the few things I love more than names, Lego. Lego, like Denmark and Copenhagen, is a combination of two Danish words, leggot, as you can, play pretty well with Lego. Trust me. It was
continents and continents into countries. However, sometimes we also like to group together countries and parts of continents into smaller regions. These regions of continents usually have a shared history, culture, or even language. Take the likes of Scandinavia up in Northern Europe, or Central America in, well, Central America. The region of the world we are looking into today, however, is located in the southeast of Europe, and these countries are collectively known as the Balkans. Unlike other regions, however, like the aforementioned Scandinavia and Central America, which are pretty defined borders, what is and isn't Balkan doesn't seem to be as universally agreed upon. While some nations are seen as pretty much 100% Balkan, others are a bit more up for debate. The two most debated Balkan nations are Greece and Turkey. While geographically part of these two countries are in the Balkan Peninsula, they just aren't as linked to this part of the world. This seems to be the case for a couple reasons. As mentioned, these regions of the world are often linked together in history, and Greece and Turkey just don't share as much common history with the other nations, especially considering that neither of them were once part of Yugoslavia, whereas 7 of the countries we'll be talking about today are. Like I said, what is and isn't Balkan is really up for debate. Even Italy is debated sometimes as being a Balkan state. I have no doubt you guys will be talking about it down in the comments. In this video, however, we'll be covering the nations that are most universally agreed upon as being Balkan. I'm going in particular with the ones Encyclopedia Britannica go with too, so don't blame me if you're annoyed. Blame them. By their definition, the Balkans are usually characterized as consisting of Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, and Albania. It's these 10 countries we'll be looking into today, so we won't be looking into Greece or Turkey, I'm afraid. But have no fear, as we've already covered these two nations in videos unto themselves. In fact, I may have actually already covered all these names in videos in one way or another previously on the channel, whether that be because these countries were featured in part of another video, or they had videos unto themselves. But you may have not been interested in those videos, which is fair enough. This video format is popular here on the channel, so why not cover them like this too? And what format is this exactly, I hear you asking? Well, it's when we take a region of the world and look into the origins of not only the nation's names, but the capital's names too, and see if we can find some extra etymological fun facts along the way as well. But before we look into the names of the countries, we ought to look into the name Balkan unto itself. The peninsula as a whole is actually named after the Balkan Mountains. This mountain range runs across Bulgaria and Serbia. As to where its name comes from, we have a few ideas. In Turkish, Balkan literally means chain of wooded mountains, so it might come from this, while another idea is that it comes from an old Bulgarian word simply meaning mountain, while another idea is that it comes from Persian roots meaning either swampy forest or even high proud house. It's one of those names we just aren't too sure about, but there's definitely a wide range of ideas for it, that's for sure. The largest of the Balkan states we'll be looking into today is Romania, and just by looking at this name, I'm sure you'll start to get a good idea as to where it comes from. The word Roman is quite clearly in the name Romania. This unsurprisingly relates to the empire, as the land that now makes up Romania was once upon a time part of the Roman Empire. It became Roman in the early 2nd century AD thanks to Emperor Trajan's conquest of the land. Before this, the corresponding land was called Dacia, and despite Rome giving up the land in around 270 AD, their impact there had been not only left in the land's name, but also in the language, as Romanian itself is a Romance language in the middle of Slavic-speaking Europe. The tongue has more in common with the likes of French and Spanish than it does with its neighbouring nations. The nation's capital is Bucharest, and this name doesn't come from a group of people, but one legendary figure, that being the legendary farmer slash shepherd Bucur. It was him who supposedly founded the city many years ago, and in turn it's named after him. However, other ideas imply that it comes from Dacian origins and means city of joy, as the modern word for joy in the Romanian language is Bucuria. Next up we have Slovenia, which is a name that relates to the people who live there, as it simply means land of the Slavs. Slovakia means pretty much the same thing too, as they are both nations home to Slavic people, hence why their names are similar. However, they are home to different kinds of Slavic people. Slovenia is a South Slavic nation, while Slovakia is a West Slavic nation, and this geographic difference affected them enough to slightly change the names of their respective nations, yet still leave them sounding slightly similar. Luckily, these two nations don't have similar sounding capitals. In fact, Slovenia's capital has the rather unique name of Ljubljana. L and J's don't have a habit of appearing next to each other in English words, so it's pretty cool to see it here twice in a single word. There's a few ideas as to what this name means. One is that it too traces back to the Romans, possibly coming from their word alluviana, meaning flooding river. I guess the river in the city flooded often in the past. While the other idea is that it comes from the Slovene word Ljubljana, meaning beloved, as the city is beloved. Croatia is too thought to derive from the people who live there, with the name meaning land of the Croats. Their name is thought to possibly come from ancient Russian roots, meaning things like mountain or even mountain chain, I guess in relation to the mountains in the nation. One of Croatia's historic regions is called Dalmatia, and it was of course this region where a certain spotted dog came from and was named after. Croatia's capital of Zagreb has a name with an unclear etymology. One idea is that it comes from ancient roots meaning hill, however has a popular folk etymology too, which is worth sharing. This folk etymology is that the name of the city means to scoop / dig, and the accompanying story explains that a young girl scooped up water from this area to rehydrate her thirsty city governor, and from where she scooped up the water, the city grew. I would say, however, Croatia's most popular city is Dubrovnik, and this name means oakwood, as the city was surrounded by oak trees in the past. Next up, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the one nation with two names. These two names reference two regions of the country, and instead of the nation having one unique name, it just went with the two of them. It's rather interesting but not unique, as we have other nations like Trinidad and Tobago that have this trait too. The Bosnia part of the name comes from the river Bosna, and this name is thought to mean current, as rivers do have currents. The Herzegovina part, however, comes from Old Serbian and means dukedom, as this land was once run by a duke. This explains why it sounds so much like the modern German word for duke too, Herzog. The nation's capital Sarajevo comes from Turkish roots and means palace on the river Bosna, which makes sense as there are some amazing looking palaces / castles / fortresses in the nation. Montenegro up next, and while this name might seem complex and hard to understand at first glance, it's pretty darn obvious once you look at it a little while longer. It comes from Romance roots and simply means black mountain. Just look at the name, it's quite clearly there with the Monte part meaning mountain and the Negro part meaning black. black. The specific black mountain the name is thought to allude to is Lofsen, which was fully covered in thick, dark green trees once upon a time. So dark in fact the mountain would have looked completely black. The capital's name is also somewhat literal too, that naming Podgorica. Podgorica simply means place below Gorica, with Gorica being the name of the nearby hill the city was built in the shadow of. I'd love to know if all the names in the nation are somewhat literal like this. With Serbia we have another ear name, with it meaning a land of the Serbs, with Serbs being the people who live there. As to where their name came from, however, there's a few ideas. One is that it simply comes from ancient roots meaning man, while there are other ideas that might come from words meaning slave, or even cypress as in the type of trees. It's one of those words we just aren't too sure of, I'm afraid. Serbia's capital is called Belgrade. The latter part of this name is a variation of the ever popular grad suffix we see with many cities and towns. In fact, Belgrade is the only capital city in the world with it, and when Petrograd reassumed the name St. Petersburg, it became the biggest grad too. This suffix simply means town/city, and the former part of the name means white, so the name means white city. The white in this name may relate to the White Serbs, a Slavic tribe from this part of the world. And south of Serbia is Kosovo, which yes I know is debated as to whether it's a country or not, meaning mentioning it here will anger people, but I'm from the UK. The UK recognises Kosovo's independence, so I recognise the nation. The nation's name is rather unique. It means a field of blackbirds. This is in reference to the Battle of Kosovo, which took place in the late 14th century on Kosovo Field, with Kosovo Field being a large plain in the nation. Why it relates to blackbirds, however, I'm not too sure. Perhaps there were literal blackbirds on the field, or maybe blackbird is a nickname for soldiers. The capital's name of Pristina, however, is thought to mean things like to splash or spray due to water in the area, which makes it a really playful name, I suppose. Bulgaria's name once again comes from the people who live there, that being the Bulgars. Their name is possibly thought to come from origins meaning to disturb or revolt or even rebel, which are pretty interesting terms, that's for sure. However, another idea is that the name means men from the Volga, with Volga being an old name for the river Volga, the longest river in Europe. The nation's capital has the rather pleasant name of Sofia. The city was named after someone called Sophia. The name Sophia didn't come from the city, it would seem. That specific Sophia being St. Sophia. When the St. Sophia Church set up a shop in the capital, eventually the whole city was named after it. Sophia as a name means wisdom, so it's pretty cool to have that name for a city too. North Macedonia has only recently acquired this name. Before this it was known as just Macedonia, and even the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia. This all relates to a naming dispute between the nation and its southern neighbour of Greece about who has the right to that name. We covered it a while back when the debate was still going on. Macedonia comes from the Macedonians fittingly. Their name is thought to mean things like tall ones and Highlanders. I love how these two ideas don't match up perfectly. Like, you don't have to be tall to be a Highlander, but as both high and tall are words meaning something that goes up a long way, these two ideas have become mixed. It's a fun idea of how words and languages can get muddled up over time. North Macedonia's capital is Skopje, and this city's name simply means outpost or guard post. I guess perhaps the city began life as a watch outpost for soldiers. And finally we have Albania. This is often one of the first countries talked about, due to coming second when all nations are sorted alphabetically, so it's fun to see it talked about last here. The nation has a completely different name in its incredibly unique tongue, that being Shqiperis, which means the land of eagles, hence why there's an eagle on their flag. The name we use in English, however, is thought to relate to hills, possibly meaning land of hills, hence why the first part of the name sounds somewhat like Alps. And as for their capital, Tirana, it's only fitting that the last name we look at once again remains a mystery, though as I've said a lot in this video, we have a few theories. One idea is that it means fallen material. One idea is that it means fallen material in relation to nearby weathered mountains, or that it may come from an old Greek word meaning dairy, as the land was once a place farmers would gather to trade dairy. We just aren't too sure. Nevertheless, that's the names of the Balkans explained.
Europe is a cold but interesting part of the world. What's so interesting about it I find is there are so many names you'll hear for chunks of it being referred to as. Words like Nordic, Scandinavia and Baltic all spring to mind. Nordic is perhaps the most all-encompassing of these words. The term covers the nations of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden and all the extra land these nations have like Greenland and Svalbard. Meanwhile, just Scandinavia refers to just the nations of Denmark, Norway and Sweden. Baltic, the name we're interested in today however, refers to none of the aforementioned places. Instead it refers to the three nations of Latvia, Lithuania Lithuania and Estonia. In all of this, I feel poor Finland loses out the most. While it's a Nordic country, it doesn't belong with either the Scandinavian countries, which many presume, or the Baltic countries, which many presume too. Poor Finland. Anyway, that's enough of being sad for Finland. You guys know what today's video is all about. Today we're going to be looking at the countries that make up the Baltic states, /countries, /republics, /nations as they are known as variously. Honestly though, I kind of just like the Baltic. It has a much nicer ring to it. And we've made videos like this in the past where we've looked at aforementioned Scandinavia and the much warmer Iberia. If you've seen those videos, you will know how this one will go down too. We'll be looking at the countries that make up the Baltic and their capitals and find out how they got their names. Plus, I'd like to dive into some other fun facts about the countries too. However, something I find myself thinking about too is why are these three countries tied together to form the Baltic states? What is the unifying factor between the three of them? There are many countries which reside next to each other on our planet, but you don't hear them forming little groups like this. Well, it seems that the main thing that ties them together is their location, or being next to the Baltic Sea, which we'll talk about soon enough, as their cultures, national identities, or even languages aren't that similar. The languages of Latvian and Lithuanian both descend from Balto-Slavic branches, while Estonian is a Finnic language, tying them much closer to Finland, who as we mentioned, don't get the chance to be part of this club. And while they do have a shared history, some think this isn't enough to really unite them. I was reading ideas as to if these three nations should unite as one, and many seem to think not. It was interesting to read that while Latvia might share borders with both nations and have some other things in common, that bond isn't there between Lithuania and Estonia. Though this is just me regurgitating from one person I found speaking online. I'm sure there are many Lithuanians and Estonians who live and work together. Nevertheless, a connection has been made between these three countries, and the concept of the Baltic states has endured since. There's even the Baltic Assembly, an intergovernmental organisation between the three nations that aims to find a common position on international issues. Anyway, before we look into the specific names for these nations, let's look into the name of this land there as a whole. Why exactly is it called the Baltic anyway? Well, this region of land is actually named after the sea next to it, the Baltic Sea, and once again, just to make things confusing about why these three countries are called the Baltic, other nations reside on the Baltic Sea too but aren't considered Baltic. This includes Finland, Russia, Poland, Germany and Sweden, as well as the Baltic countries. Why all these countries aren't considered Baltic, I'll never know. Borders are truly silly things. As for what the name Baltic means, there seems to be a few ideas. Initially it was the medieval Latin Balticus, and this is probably believed to come from one of two origins. It either comes from the Lithuanian Baltas meaning white, or the Scandinavian Balta meaning belt/strait. In all honesty, both of these make sense as the sea and the surrounding land is rather white, what with the snow and all. However, it meaning belt and strait makes sense too. There are other bodies of water that have names like this too, like the Strait of Gibraltar, and the Baltic Sea is narrow like a belt and somewhat straight. Both really could be the correct answer, we just don't know. Though what's interesting is that in Germanic languages like German and Dutch, the sea is named the East Sea as it's in the east of these countries that call it that. Though this hasn't transitioned over to English, which is weird as English is too a Germanic language and the Baltic is to the east of England. Though, what about the countries that make up the Baltic? First off, let's look into Latvia. Latvia covers an area just over 64,000 kilometers, but within that land are around 2 million residents. While I'm sure for a lot of people snow will come to mind when they think of Latvia, 54% of the country is forest, making it one of the greenest countries in Europe. It even has sandy beaches, though the water is apparently rather chilly, which is understandable. The Latvian flag has been in its current use since 1280, meaning it's one of the oldest flags still in use, the only one older than it being Denmark's. And something I found really interesting, a Latvian man who went by the name Jacob W. Davis when he emigrated to the USA is credited as the inventor of something you may be wearing right now: jeans. As for the name Latvia, it seems to follow the etymology for countries we see so often, with it being named after a group of people, with this group of people being the ancient tribe of the Latgalians. Where their name comes from, however, seems to remain a mystery. What's interesting, however, is that the name was Latinized to Latgalia, and some languages to this day use names for the country that sound more like this than the English Latvia. Take the German name for the country, Letland, and the Spanish Letonia. In fact, this name has even had effects on the English language too, as another name for the Latvian people in English is the Lets, though I must admit I've never heard this term, and Wikipedia itself claims that the term Lets is becoming obsolete. Latvia's capital Riga is home to about 1/3 of the entire Latvian population. It is also known as the Paris of the North due to how beautiful the city is, and I can vouch for this as it's a part of the world I've actually had the pleasure of visiting. While I can vouch for its nickname, I can't say too much for its actual name, as we don't seem to know too much about it. One idea is it comes from the Livonian language word ringa, which means loop, referring to the natural loop in the river by nearby Riga. Also, the Livonian language belongs to the Livonian people, another group of people who resided in North Latvia and South Estonia. I should have mentioned them earlier. Though, speaking of the Livonians who lived in South Estonia, now is a good time to start talking about Estonia. Estonia is much smaller than Latvia at just over 45,000 kilometers squared, and this is reflected in their population too of just over 1.3 million people residing in the country. A population this low means that Estonia is actually one of Europe's least crowded countries. Luckily, you can traverse all that space with their free public transport, at least in their capital anyway. And most interestingly, Skype was invented by a team of Estonians. In fact, the people of Estonia are very tech savvy, and the capital has been dubbed the Silicon Valley of Europe due to how many startups have started up there. Now, when it comes to the name Estonia, there's a trap you may fall for, and that's thinking that the name derives from the word east, as Estonia sounds somewhat like east, and Estonia is in the east of Europe. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. Once again, it's a group of people we have to look towards for this name, this time being the Esti people. These people were written about by Roman historian Tacitus in 98 AD. However, there were some major differences between them and modern Estonians. First off, they were believed to be a Baltic people, and as we mentioned, modern Estonians are Finnic. And where Tacitus talked about the Esti people residing does not match up with modern Estonia, so Estonia is named after these people who they have very little in common with, which is pretty odd now that I think about it. Their capital city of Tallinn, however, has a much more interesting story as how its name came to be, and once again, like with Estonia, the name is thought to possibly derive from people not actually native to the land. The name is believed to come from the old Estonian Tani Lin, which means Danish town / castle, as the castle there and the subsequent town were built by the Danish. However, others have put across the idea the name might also be translated into meaning winter town / castle, or even farmstead town / castle. However, this isn't the name the city has always gone by. For a huge amount of history between the 13th and 20th century, the city was known as Reval, and prior to this, the city has gone by a slew of different names, primarily because the city has been under control of so many different people. Primarily though, the city has been under control of the Russians, Danish, Germans, and finally Estonians. In its history, the city has been known as, and apologies for pronunciation here, Kalavan, Kolivan, Lindanzia, Rafala, and of course Reval, as we mentioned. It seems the name Tallinn was brought back when Estonia achieved independence in 1918. And finally we have Lithuania, which is the largest of the Baltic states in size and population at over 65,000 kilometers big and with a population of almost 2.8 million people. From my research, it seems that Lithuania is home to some really old stuff. I found that the oldest tree in Europe is in Lithuania, and that Lithuanian is one of the oldest languages in the world today. Lithuania is also considered to be at the geographic centre of all of Europe. While it definitely doesn't look like the centre of the continent to myself, apparently this was figured out by using the centre of gravity of the geometric figure of Europe, whatever that means. Though something that will make much more sense to us is the meaning of the name Lithuania. There is a popular belief that the name comes from the Lithuanian lyti, meaning to rain, as it seems the nation is rather rainy. But despite this, there isn't actually any proof that the name comes from this. A more popular theory is that the name relates to the Latin litus, meaning shore, and the name would mean shoreland, which would make sense as the country has over 260 kilometers of coastline, so the name may be water related, just beach water, not rainwater. And Lithuania's capital is called Vilnius. This name too is watery based, being named after the Vilnia river that runs through the city. Though this leaves us with the question, where does this name come from? Well, apparently this means to surge, which makes sense as the waters of rivers do often surge, and I imagine this one is no different. The legendary story as how this city came to be is fun too. The story goes that the Grand Duke of Lithuania at that time was on a hunting trip in a nearby forest. One night on the trip he had a strange dream that upon a hill where he had recently killed a bison that day stood an iron wolf. On this hill it howled out with its head raised in pride. When he woke, he consulted with one of his priests about this dream, who told him it was a sign to build a town there, and so the town was founded where the iron wolf once stood. Now, you may think this is all the countries of the Baltic covered. However, there's actually one more. Well, kind of. In the capital of Lithuania, we have the neighbourhood of Užupis, which on April 1st, 1998, declared itself independent as the Republic of Užupis. Now, if you couldn't tell by the fact this was on April 1st, then this was done as something of a silly joke. But nevertheless, it has its own government, president, constitution, flag, and currency. At less than 1 kilometer square in size, it's one of the smallest republics in the world, but one nonetheless. So let's look into that name. The name actually ties in neatly with Vilnius, as it means beyond the river, or even the other side of the river, as well that's where the republic is. The highlight of this republic, however, has to be their constitution, which includes points such as people have the right to be happy, people have the right to be unhappy, and most importantly, a dog has the right to be a dog. Russia was named after the people who lived and settled the land, in this case being the Rus people. The Rus were a tribe of Vikings who are thought to have come from Sweden in the 9th century. Even though the lands of Russia were populated at the time, some scholars believe that the local people of the town of Novgorod in Russia asked them to come settle their disputes with each other. The Rus stayed in the land, founding cities and opening up trade routes around the country, so much so that by the 16th century we have evidence the land was called in medieval Latin Lusi, meaning the people of Russia. If Russia is named after the Rus people, then how did the Rus people get their name? It's thought their name comes from the Old Norse term lods, meaning men who row, as rowing was the main way the Rus and all other Vikings traversed the waters around them. If that sounded familiar to any of you, that's because I just plagiarized myself. This etymology of Russia is taken from my book, The Origin of Names, Words and Everything in Between. Link to purchase it in the description, hint hint, because why write a new etymology for Russia when I have a perfectly good one already? Anyway, if I were to ask you to point to the country called Russia on a map, I'm sure you would point here. I mean, it's a pretty big country and you'd be correct. This country is called Russia. However, you could also point here and be correct. Well, kinda. Nevertheless, you've fallen for my clickbait, so why not stick around? This is of course the country of Belarus. With an area of over 200,000 kilometers squared, Belarus holds the unique title of Europe's largest landlocked country. It shares its border with 5 other countries, these being Ukraine, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania and Russia. The nation has a population of around 9.5 million and its capital and largest city is of course Minsk, a name that will ring bells in the minds of many Friends fans. If you look at the name Belarus, I'm sure you will notice Rus at the very end. This Rus does in fact relate to the aforementioned Rus people who lent their name to the largest country on the planet. Though what about the Bela part of Belarus's name? This is believed to come from a Slavic root for white, which makes sense. If you look at other Slavic language words for white, they look very much like this. This means the name is often translated into meaning White Russia. And fun fact, in the past there were also land masses which had names that translate into Black Russia and Red Russia. Though for today we aren't too interested in those. The earliest written evidence we have for this name comes from Latin and German literature of the 14th century, where it was referred to as Alba Russia. While we know the name can be translated to mean White Russia, why is this the case? The Russia part is obviously because this land, much like Russia, was settled by the aforementioned Rus people. Though what exactly made these Rus white? Well, on that we aren't too sure, though we have a few theories. One theory has to do with the fact that it was the Rus in these lands that followed Christianity, and white is a colour that is heavily associated with Christianity. Go into any church and I'm sure you'll find plenty of white there. The second theory is simply because the Rus who lived in this land wore a lot of white clothing. It's a simple idea, but a lot of the time the simplest theories are the correct ones. The third theory relates to not the colour of the Rus' clothing, but the colour of their skin. At this time there was another tribe claiming land across Russia and Asia, the Tatars. These people supposedly originated from Mongolia, so they would not have been the same skin tone as the Rus. To signify this area wasn't run by these differently coloured people, it became known as White Russia. We don't know for sure what exactly made these Rus so white, but the name persevered and the country still bears it to this day, sharing the Russia part of its name with the actual country of Russia. Yet, despite the fact I built this video entirely around the concept that this country is also called Russia in some shape or form, this might not actually be the case. Yes, I know I'm the worst, go tell me how awful I am in the comment section, I live for your rage. This is because the Rus in Belarus may not refer to Russia, but instead refer to Ruthenia. Ruthenia being the name for another old area of Europe, with the name once again deriving from the Rus people. The Independent has an interesting article titled The Lost Nation of Ruthenia. Perhaps in some alternative history, a nation by the name of Ruthenia is still present on our globe. Anyway, while the Rus in Belarus definitely seems to relate to the Rus people, whether these were Ruthenian Ruses or Russian Ruses, we don't know. And just to make matters more confusing, I even read theories that the Bela part doesn't even mean white. One theory I read is that the Bela part comes from Germanic roots meaning west, which might seem odd at first as Belarus is east of Germany, but Belarus is also on the more western parts of the Rus land. I think it's that approach they were going for with this etymology. One very weird theory I also came across is that the country is named after a beautiful girl called Rus, and the Bela part comes from some old word for beautiful. While these theories exist, it seems that the idea of it meaning white is far more concrete and accepted. Meaning if we follow one certain etymological route for this country, then yes, we end up with a second country called Russia. Well, White Russia anyway. And if this name is making anyone thirsty, that's because there's a drink called a White Russian, a cocktail served with ice made with vodka, coffee liqueur and cream, which can often be replaced with milk. Despite the name, the drink wasn't invented in Russia or Belarus, but rather in Belgium by barman Gustav Tops in 1949. Initially it was called a Black Russian, but with the addition of cream and the change of colour in the drink thanks to the cream, White Russian was more fitting. Of course, the Russian part comes from the fact that it contains vodka, a very Russian drink. So despite the similar names, this White Russian has nothing to do with this White Russian.
Switzerland has many things unique to it. It's chocolate, it's watches, it's banking. Yet the one thing it hasn't really got of its own is its own language. Switzerland is a landlocked country being bordered by Italy, France, Germany, Liechtenstein and Austria. It's because of its surroundings and the fact that Switzerland is less of a traditional country and more a collection of states called cantons that agree to work together as a country that gives us the reason why it has not one Swiss language but 4 official languages in the country. These 4 languages are German in the north and centre, French in the west, Italian in the south and a language called Romansh dotted around in the east. Though of course the languages do intertwine at times and English is spoken pretty well throughout the country. And of course each of these languages have a different name for the country of Switzerland. But what about that actual name of just Switzerland? Well, this name is its English name and not even its official name in English. Officially the country is called the Swiss Confederation, as it's a confederation of cantons, remember? Like many country names that end with land, the first part of the name refers to the people who live in the land. However, today the natives of Switzerland are called the Swiss. So why isn't the country called Swissland? Well, this is because Switzer was the name for the people of the land in the past, before Swiss became more popular, coming from the French Suisse. But more on that later. The people of the land were originally called the Switzer after one of the founding cantons of the country, Schwyz. Also, the coat of arms of the canton of Schwyz is where the flag of the country as a whole comes from. So where does just this name of Schwyz come from? Unfortunately, we aren't too sure or have a clear answer to this. One idea is that it comes from the verb Sudan of Old High German origin, which means to burn, in relation to the slash and burn technique for clearing woodland to make it habitable, which could have taken place in the founding of the land of Schwyz. One idea for the name even delves into Swiss folklore, with the legend being that the Schwyz comes from the name of the legendary founder of the land, Swit, who killed his own brother in combat to claim dominance over the land. Killing your own brother to claim rule of a land? Where have I heard that myth before? Nevertheless, it was this name that was used for the land, with the people of the land becoming the Switzer and the country as a whole being called Switzerland. But like I said earlier, Switzerland has 4 languages, with each language calling the Swiss Confederation a different name, although the names are rather similar to one another, all deriving from that original name of Schwyz. Though what's also interesting is it's only the English name of Switzerland that puts land on the end. The official German name is Schweizerische Eidgenossenschaft, shortened to just Schweiz. In French, this is Confédération Suisse, shortened to just Suisse. In Italian, it's Confederazione Svizzera, shortened to just Svizzera. And in Romansh, it's Confederazione Svizzera, shortened to just Svizzera. Blimey. Feel free to complain about my pronunciation errors down below. Sources will be in the description as usual. Yet, Switzerland and these 4 names aren't the only names the Confederation has gone by. A more traditional name for the land that used sometimes in the German-speaking parts of the country is Eidgenossenschaft, which is seen in the country's official name in German. This name has roots too in the legendary founding of the country, the legendary oath at Rütli, with this name coming from the German Eid, meaning oath, and Genossenschaft, meaning cooperative. But perhaps the most well-known alternative name for Switzerland is Helvetia. This name is Latin and comes from the Helvetians, the first recorded settlers of the land before the modern Swiss moved in. This name can still be seen today in things like Swiss postage stamps. It's far easier to fit on a stamp than all 4 names in the country's languages, with Helvetia herself, the country's female national personification, and of course the Swiss created typeface, Helvetica.
Chances are, if you're a fan of my videos, you are probably a fan of this guy's videos, so I don't need to explain to you the differences between Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and so on. So when I say Great Britain, you know I'm talking about this piece of land, and you know what? It is great. Well, most of the time. But so are a lot of other places in the world, yet you don't hear Finland calling themselves Great Finland.
It's funny, as a Brit myself, I hear the name Great Britain constantly and always presumed it was just us, the British, being big-headed, arrogant, self-absorbed snobs. While yes, now the Great in Great Britain is associated with great in the high-quality sense, it actually originated with great in the large in size sense, meaning the land should really be called Greater Britain. So yes, there are Lesser Britons. At least 2 places have been honoured with this title, most noticeably the French province of Brittany. Both Britain and Brittany have been referred to as Brittany Major and Brittany Minor respectively by various authors. The oldest naming of a Greater and Lesser Britain comes from the writer Ptolemy in his writings Almagest, written between 147 and 148 AD. He referred to the larger island as Great Britain and the smaller island as Little Britain, which, let's face facts, is adorable. Okay, size aside, to properly explain to you what makes Britain great, I need to explain to you what makes Britain Britain. In the same way the United Kingdom and Great Britain are 2 different things, so are Great Britain and plain old Britain. Greek explorer Pythias was the first person to use a written form of the name Britain when he came across the land on an exploration in the 4th century BCE. Pythias referred to the land under 2 different names, Britanniae and Pretanique. Variations of these 2 names led to a quite interesting name for the land, Britannia, which of course is very similar to Britannia. I had no idea about this name for my country, but it makes a lot of sense as Pythias in his manuscripts did use P instead of B a variety of times. The etymology of Pretanique makes more sense, referring to the tribe of painted people he came across on the land, the Pretani, and Britain, as far as I could tell, just kind of turned up. Yet of course when the Romans eventually came, saw and conquered, the area of the island they claimed was named the province of Britannia, which only covered modern day England and Wales. This means that just Britain on its own only refers to the countries of England and Wales. So what about Scotland? The land area we now know as Scotland was never truly conquered by the Romans and stayed as its own independent nation. As time went on, the entire island became known as Britain, and the plain old Britain I mentioned earlier, which covered the areas of modern day England and Wales, became known as the Kingdom of England, and north to the Kingdom of England lay the Kingdom of Scotland. While these 2 kingdoms were their own separate countries, they shared some things. Most noticeably in 1603 they began to share a monarch in the shape of King James VI of Scotland. He gained the English throne for a branch in the family tree that makes no sense at all to me. From 1603 till 1707 the kingdoms shared a monarch, meaning that whoever was on the throne technically had 2 crowns on their head. It was only until the Act of Union 1707 the parliaments of each kingdom agreed to join together to not only create an awesome flag, but officially become the Kingdom of Great Britain. So in summary, Great Britain could have been called Great Britain. It became great not because of its quality but because it was the greater in size Britain, and it officially got the title Great Britain when Scotland joined the kingdom. So technically what makes Britain great is Scotland. Perceive that as you wish.
Find a certain country, a nation with Prague as its capital, with an obsession for castles, mountains and beer. So much beer. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't said the name of this country. However, I'm sure you know I'm talking about the Czech Republic, what with the thumbnail title and everything. Though there are many names that this country has gone by, some stuck around for a long time but have since become outdated relics of the past. Some may even argue that the name I used, Czech Republic, is out of date too. So what exactly should you call this country? And what names has this nation gone by in the past? The Czech Republic is a nation with a seriously rich history, especially with its neighbouring Slovakia. In fact, these 2 nations were once one singular nation under the name Czechoslovakia, and while Slovakia will play a role in this video, today we will be primarily focusing on the Czech part of this name. We actually covered Slovakia in a different video altogether and why its name is similar to Slovenia, so go check that out for the other side of this story. The part of this name we will be focusing on comes from those who lived in the land, the Czechs. While we aren't too sure as to how this name came about initially, the story that seems to be most popular for the naming of these people is that it was the name of one of the 3 legendary brothers who founded lands in Europe. These 3 brothers being Lech, Czech and Rus. The story goes that each brother founded land in Europe and lent their name to it, these lands being Poland, the Czech Republic and Russia respectively. So when the land of the Czechs was joined with the land of the Slovaks, their names were simply simply put together to form the name Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia is a name I feel that people may still name this nation, as the nation of Czechoslovakia only truly split into two separate nations in 1993. And while for some that may seem like a really long time ago, for me it's 1 year before I was born. To others, the majority of their lives was spent with a nation being called Czechoslovakia, so it's understandable why older people may still call this Czechoslovakia. It can be hard to shake off old habits. Now, I've kind of started this story somewhere in the middle, as while Czechoslovakia is perhaps one of the most commonly known previous names for these lands, there are names that came before it and names that have come after it, with one of the most renowned ancient names for these lands being Bohemia, which once again we looked at in a video all to itself. Bohemia is a name that once again comes from the people who lived there, the Celtic Boy tribe. However, Bohemia wasn't alone in forming or go on to become the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, as there was also the historic regions of Moravia and Czech Silesia. These three regions together made up an area of the world what are now known as the Czech lands, and seem to more or less form the modern borders of the Czech Republic. The region of Moravia got its name through the river that runs through it, the Morava. The name at Silesia isn't too clear, it may have come from the name of a Germanic people who lived in the area. The reason this is specifically called Czech Silesia, however, is due to this being just the Czech part of Silesia, a historic region that overlapped the Czech lands and other nations. Also, bonus tangent etymology, apparently it's from Silesia that we got the word sleazy from. Apparently sleazy originally meant fuzzy, and the theory goes that a type of fuzzy fabric was made in Silesia, so this fuzzy fabric was described as being sleazy as it came from Silesia, and the word just stuck around and changed meaning. As time went on, the Czech lands and their neighbouring Slovakia became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which they stayed a part of all the way until 1918, when this empire collapsed in the fallout of the First World War. It was after this that the nation of Czechoslovakia formed, which we talked about at the start of this video. This initial iteration of Czechoslovakia lasted till 1939. It was this year that the Munich Pact was signed between Germany, Italy, France and the UK, which held off war but gave Czechoslovakia to Germany. Initially it was only meant to be one small part of Czechoslovakia, but eventually those who should not be named due to YouTube demonetization took over and occupied all of the country. Under German occupation, the nation of Czechoslovakia was split into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the Slovak Republic, with the Germans giving the Czech part of Czechoslovakia the older names we mentioned previously. Of course, with the Second World War coming to an end and the Prague Uprising taking place, Czechoslovakia soon found itself free of German occupation. It was after the Second World War that communism started to grow more popular in the nation. They even signed a friendship treaty with the Soviets to help cement communism's place in Czechoslovakia. However, this friendship turned sour when the Soviets disallowed Czechoslovakia from receiving US help. The communists wanted to control the country, and this led to riots in the streets of Prague, and eventually the Soviets taking control of the nation in 1945. During this time under communist rule, once again the nation got a new name, but not too different. It was called the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, and within this we had the Czech Socialist Republic and the Slovak Socialist Republic. What I found interesting about this is that this seems like the first time the land area that would become the Czech Republic had the word Czech in its official name. At least I think it is. I know it was formerly known as the Czech lands, but I don't know if that name was ever used officially. I'm happy to be wrong though, so let me know down below if I am. Communist rule in this country eventually came to an end in 1989 through revolution, but not the kind of revolution that you usually think of. This revolution was a series of peaceful protests and demonstrations across the nation. Perhaps the most noticeable thing about this revolution is that not a single person died due to it. It was a gentler revolution, and because of this it became known as the Velvet Revolution, as velvet is gentle too. A playwright by the name of Václav Havel became the first person to become president post-communist regime. However, this sparked the biggest, most volatile and disastrous war to hit the nation yet, the Hyphen War. Okay, so maybe I was being a tad over dramatic there. The Hyphen War was a tongue-in-cheek name given to the debacle over what to call the nation post-Velvet Revolution. In 1990, Czechoslovak Parliament was unable to figure out what to call the nation. The Slovak side wanted to put a hyphen in the name to allow the Slovak part to stand out. This seems to have eventually been settled, with the nation becoming named the Czech and Slovak Federal Republic. However, this communist and hyphen-free iteration of Czechoslovakia wouldn't last long. This new name was appointed in 1990, and by 1993 it was agreed that the nation would split into two separate countries. This separation became known as the Velvet Divorce, in ode to the former Velvet Revolution, and due to the fact that, like the revolution, there was minimal violence in the process. The Czech and Slovak population of the country had been together for a while and they were just drifting apart. Different ideologies were emerging between the two groups, and a separation of the two places seemed to be in the best interest to everyone. Truth be told, this sounds like a far cleaner breakup than any other breakup I know about. Credit to them. So on December 31st, 1992, Czechoslovakia ceased to exist, and in its place were two new countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which came into being the next day on January 1st, 1993. And that brings us all the way to now, except one more name for the Czech Republic has risen to prominence. In 2016, the name Czechia was approved by their government. While they still wanted to maintain the Czech Republic as their full official name, they also wanted to make Czechia their official short name. This is because pretty much every other nation has two names, their official name and their official shortened name. We all know this country is France, but officially it's called the French Republic. Since breaking up with Slovakia, the Czech Republic never actually got an official short name, instead being always referred to by its full title when other nations were being called by their official short titles. Even Slovakia got a short name, with its official name being the Slovak Republic. Feeling left out for long enough, the name Czechia was created as their official short name, with the name having mixed results. I actually talked about this in a previous video when Czechia was a more recent creation. It's actually crazy how often I've talked about the Czech Republic but not actually made a video about them. Sorry to my Czech viewers, I hope this makes up for it. When I talked about this back in 2017, not only did I speak like a robot still, seriously, how did I sound like that? I discussed how despite it being the official name for the nation and how much the government were using it, it wasn't really catching on. 3 years later, however, this still seems to be the case. Well, a 2018 article at least explains the name still isn't that popular. Language is an odd beast and something you can't really control. You can demand something be called something, but if no one wants to use it, it simply won't happen. Names only work when everyone accepts that it's its name, and it still seems that Czechia isn't being accepted. Though maybe I'm wrong, I'm just a guy sitting in a basement in England. People in Czechia, let me know how that name is going over there. Of course, I guess neither the Czech Republic or Czechia are their actual names, as these are merely their names in my native tongue of English. In Czech, these names are actually Česká republika and Česko. So I guess if you really want to name this nation by the correct name, you should be using one of these two. That however brings us back to the initial question I had about this. What should you call the Czech Republic? Despite all the names it has had in the past, I think it's pretty safe to say we should only really be using the Czech Republic and Czechia these days. Though, which one? Well, I guess it all depends on your view in the matter. If you want to stick with the Czech Republic or if you want to go with the new name of Czechia. I personally quite like Czechia. It gives the nation a short name like everywhere else and even gives us another ear nation to add to the map. I feel it all depends on context. If you are using countries' short names, then why not use the Czechia name? But if you are using long official names, then maybe stick with the Czech Republic. Like I said, that's my own view on it. There doesn't really seem to be a correct answer on this, no matter how much the Czech government tries to make Czechia a thing. However, something you shouldn't call it is just Czech. It's a pretty easy thing to do, and I almost went to do this a couple times while writing this video. However, Czech is more an adjective than a noun, used to describe the people and the language and things from this land. It would be like saying this country is called Swedish. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the Czech Republic is a nation with a lot of history, but what I find interesting specifically about Czech history is that each period of its history seems to come with a different name for the lands. To follow the history of the Czech Republic is to follow the history of its many names, from the grand castles of Bohemia to the nation under German occupation as the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, to its modern place in the world, with the new modern name of Czechia. It is a small island country in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea, roughly located between Italy and Tunisia. No, I'm not talking about Sicily. I'm talking about Malta. You may be thinking to yourself, why on earth is he talking about Malta? And well, honestly, it's a really fun, interesting little known country. And when I say little known, I really have to emphasize the little. The Isle of Man is a small island nation off the small island nation of the UK. Here is Malta compared to the Isle of Man. Malta is also super interesting from a language point of view. Despite being so small, Malta has a language of its own, Maltese. Due to its location between Italy and Tunisia, this has given Maltese a very unique linguistic flavour. It's kind of a mix between Italian and Arabic. In fact, it's the only Semitic language written in the Latin alphabet. Perhaps most importantly to me though is that I actually have Maltese heritage, being one whole quarter Maltese. It's clearly where I get my Mediterranean good looks from. Malta has an interesting geographic and geological history too. Fossils of animals native to Europe as well as fossils of elephants, specifically adorable dwarf elephants, hippopotamuses and other African animals have been found on the island. It really is the meeting place of South Europe and North Africa. Malta is even home to some of the oldest temples and signs of civilization on Earth. Yet when I say Malta and call it an island nation, that doesn't mean it's just one island in the sea. The country of Malta is actually an archipelago composed of a few islands. There's the biggest island, which is also called Malta, the second smallest island called Gozo, and the smallest main island of Comino. The island of Malta is the most populous and home of the country's capital. Gozo is mainly rural and scenic, and Comino is hardly populated at all. So where do all these names come from? Well, let's start with the smallest island of Comino. Spanish speakers may already be familiar with this word, as in Spanish, Comino means cumin, as in the spice. It's from this name that the name of the island originates from, as cumin used to grow all across the island of Malta. It can still be found grown naturally in some places, like the island of Comino. What about the name of Gozo? This name is of Greek origins, and in Maltese it is called this. This Maltese name comes from the Greek island of Gaudos, which is a small island off the coast of Crete. The name of this Greek island was given to this Maltese island, and over time it became Gozo, no relation to a similarly named Muppet. So what about the name Malta, which, like I said, is not just the name of the country as a whole, but the name for the largest island? There's actually a couple ideas as to where the name Malta comes from. One idea is that it comes from the Latin milite, possibly from the Phoenician milita, meaning place of refuge. This is an interesting etymology, as due to its location, Malta throughout history has been an important base of operations. However, the etymology for Malta I find more interesting has a sweeter story. Malta is known for many things, from sandy beaches to ancient history. However, one thing Malta is also famous for is their honey. Malta has its own indigenous species of bee, aptly named the Maltese honeybee. I don't think I need to explain the name of that to you guys. And the honey they produce comes in a variety of flavours and shades. Even Jamie Oliver bangs on about it. This honey is so good, it's believed the name for the country could also come from the Greek milite, which comes from the Greek milir, which means honey, an island named in honour of its beautiful honey. A sweet etymology for a sweet nation.
Talking about Scandinavian countries, the obvious three nations of Norway, Sweden and Denmark always come to mind. But even when we think of the wider Nordic world, other nations come into mind, like Finland, the further away Iceland, and the even further away Greenland. However, one country that seems to get forgotten about when thinking of the world of snow and hats with horns on them, because Vikings definitely did have horns on their helmets, don't at me, is the country of the Faroe Islands, located north of Scotland. But I hear all those keyboards clicking away in the comments section because I said something clearly wrong. I don't hear you all saying that Vikings didn't have horns on their helmets, because they did, don't at me. It's the fact that I called the Faroe Islands a country when we all know it's actually a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. There's a couple reasons I said this. First off, so the title of this clickbait video would make sense, and secondly because it kind of is its own country. Officially it's an autonomous country within the Kingdom of Denmark, along with Greenland and the mainland of Denmark that makes up the entire Kingdom of Denmark. This means that the Faroe Islands do have their own government, Logtig, but bigger issues like military and foreign relations are dealt with in Copenhagen. So, how did the islands that make up the Faroe Islands end up being a part of Denmark? At first glance on a map, you may think it would more likely be a part of Scotland due to where it is, much like the Shetland Islands. Well, it's actually thought that the first settlers on the island weren't from Denmark at all, but from Ireland, specifically Irish monks. It's believed that these first settlers came across the island thanks to St. Brendan when he left Ireland in search of the promised land of the saints. One story from his travels tells us of a visit to the islands of the sheep and the paradise of birds. More on these sheep later. That was several days away of sailing from Scotland. The Faroe Islands are full of sheep, birds and are a few days away from Scotland on a sailboat, so it's very strongly believed that it was the Faroe Islands St. Brendan and his crew discovered. However, it wouldn't stay a haven for the Holy Irish. By the 9th century, Norwegian settlers came to the land, eventually leading to the Faroe Islands becoming a part of Norway. It was still a part of Norway when the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark came together to form a double monarchy in the late 14th century. Eventually, by 1814, Norway was ceded to Sweden, but the Faroe Islands stayed under control of Denmark all the way up to today. The poor Faroe Islands have always been in the possession of other nations. Funnily enough, in 1524, King of Norway and Denmark Christian II was unable to pay a loan back to King Henry VIII of England. In compensation, he offered England, Iceland and the Faroe Islands, which they refused. Of course, these are the Faroe Islands, the islands being plural. There is more than just one island that makes up the Faroe Islands, each of these islands with a name of their own. There's a lot of interesting stories behind the names of some of these islands. The biggest island is called Streymoy, and this name means Island of Currents, and the island to its east, Estoloy, simply means East Island. What's also interesting is that some of the islands are in pairs of names, such as Kalsoy and Kunoy, which mean Man Island and Woman Island respectively.
and Stora Demon and Little Demon, which mean Great Demon and Little Demon respectively. However, we're here to look for the etymology of the collective name of all these islands, that name of course being the Faroe Islands. In Faroese, the name is Faria, with this name meaning Sheep Island. The name comes from Thor, which means sheep, and the old Faroese Oya, which means islands. If you couldn't gather from that name, the Faroe Islands have a lot of sheep. In fact, their sheep population is around 70,000 compared to the roughly 50,000 humans that live on the islands. Everyone could have their own personal sheep, plus an extra 20,000 sheep going spare. Some believe the name could also relate more to the original Irish settlers, coming from the Gaelic word Fionn, which means land or estate. Some think this name came to the Norwegian settlers who added their Oya, meaning islands, becoming Fionn Oya and evolving into Faroe Islands in English, but I personally believe the more sheepish etymology. I mean, they even have a sheep on their coat of arms. England are called English. People from Finland are called Finnish. So people from the Netherlands must be Neverish, right? Well, as we all know, that really isn't the case, as people from the Netherlands are called Dutch. So how did we end up with this odd quirk in the naming of these people? But maybe I'm going too quickly, as it would seem the Netherlands is the home of awkward, confusing nomenclature. While I've been calling this country the Netherlands, it also goes by a different name, Holland. I'm sure you've seen this guy's video, but let's recap what exactly is the difference between the Netherlands and Holland, and of course how did they get their names? Well, simply put, all of Holland is the Netherlands, but not all of the Netherlands is Holland. Let me explain that a tad better. The Netherlands is split up into 12 provinces, with 2 of the more eastern provinces being called North Holland and South Holland, coming together to form an area just known as Holland. So why have the names of these 2 provinces become another name for the country as a whole? Well, it's because so much of the national identity of the Netherlands, well, at least what tourists have in mind for the Netherlands, is in Holland. The capital of the country, Amsterdam, is in North Holland and The Hague is in South Holland. The Holland provinces is also where there are countless tulips and windmills. So because so much of the stuff associated with the Netherlands is in Holland, the country as a whole became known as Holland. While that might be an explanation for what you can name what, that doesn't explain where the names came from. Well, the country isn't called the Netherlands because you never age when you're there. The name is actually to do with the lay of the land. The never in the Netherlands means low/lower, and this word never actually crops up sometimes in language, such as the term the Nether region to refer to one's private low down area. Not that I'm comparing the Netherlands to the Nether region, and yes, it's why the Nether in Minecraft is named that, as it's below the normal land. In Dutch, this name is a Nederland, which means quite literally the lower land, as the land that the Netherlands is on is so flat and low. In fact, do you know around 1/3 of the country is actually below sea level? Being so low/below sea level means that flooding is a huge issue in the Netherlands. Luckily, they've invested in some top of the range anti-flooding systems to make sure the country doesn't end up as another part of the North Sea. So what about the name Holland? Well, this name comes from the Old Dutch Hotland, meaning in English woodland, as the land where the name is thought to come from, Dordrecht, was one of the more wooded areas in the country. The word for wood in modern Dutch is hout, which isn't far at all from the earlier Old Dutch of holt. Well, that was a tad of a tangent. That's how the country got the names it goes by. And while natives of the Holland provinces are known as Hollanders, Hollanders and all the residents of the Netherlands are called Dutch, which sounds nothing like Holland or the Netherlands, and actually sounds more like what Germany is called in German, Deutschland. Well, to thank for this confusion in language, we have the presumption of the English, you're welcome, to thank. This name is of German origin. The land and the people of Germany were given so many names by others. The French called the country Allemagne, the Finnish called the country Saska, and the Swedish called the country Tyskland. Germany's own name for themselves, Deutschland, came not from a name for one of their tribes, as they didn't see themselves as tribes, but rather as just people. They called their country Fjordisk, which simply meant of the people. Over time, this word in German became Deutsch, which went into the naming of the country Deutschland. This word of Deutsch became Dutch across the channel in England, and in the ignorant misunderstanding of Europe that only the English people can achieve, the English simply referred to all speakers of Germanic language as Dutch. This of course included the Germanic speakers who lived in the Netherlands, who in English became the Dutch, as did their language. Though I guess it wasn't all due to the ignorance of the English. The land of the Netherlands and Germany were at times one and the same, like in the 1500s when they were both part of the Holy Roman Empire. There was even variations of the term Dutch in English, like High Dutch, meaning the people who who lived in the mountainous areas of Germany, and Low Dutch, referring to the people who lived in the lowlands of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is without doubt one of my favourite countries, and while this country has so many things to love, from amazing artists to amazing scenery to amazing food, it's this collection of dissimilar names, the Netherlands, Holland and Dutch, that's perhaps the most interesting thing about it. Slovakia and Slovenia have perhaps the most similar sounding names of two countries. In fact, they are so similar, SlovakRepublic.org have a page on their website explaining the confusion between the two nations, and the staff of the Slovakian and Slovenian embassies have to meet once a month to exchange posts sent to the wrong address. Surely, with names so similar, there must be a connection between the two. Both countries exist from bigger countries breaking up, with Czechoslovakia breaking into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Yugoslavia breaking up into Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and of course Slovenia. To find out how these two modern nations got their names, let's look into how these original countries of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia got their names, how they were formed and eventually split up to the nations they are today. The land area that once covered Czechoslovakia and now the Czech Republic and Slovakia was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The idea of a combined Czech and Slovakia started during the late 19th and earlier 20th century. Both groups of people felt they were being oppressed and wanted to gain their own national identity. The Czechs had a national movement through the 19th century and the Slovaks were struggling to keep their national identity after a huge nationalist movement in Hungary which repressed the Slovak people. Talks between the two people really started to kick in by the 1890s, and things only got more serious during World War I as groups of Czechs and Slovaks formed the Czechoslovakian Legion. After the Great War on May 31st, 1918, plans were put ahead to unify the two states, and on the 18th of October of that same year, Tomislav Galig-Masaryk issued a declaration of Czechoslovakian independence and went on to become the first president of the newly formed nation of Czechoslovakia. Okay, so that was going a bit off topic. You guys are here to find out how names are formed, not nations. Of course, the name Czechoslovakia comes from the two groups of people who lived there, the Czechs and the Slovaks. How the people got the name Czech is unfortunately unknown, but legends say it comes from their leader Czech, who brought them to the land. Slovak, which is what we're more interested in for the namesake of this video, simply comes from the shortening of the Proto-Slavic Slovenian. And if I said that wrong, I seriously apologise, I'm just going with what Google Translate told me to say. By the late 20th century, the nation of Czechoslovakia was waning. Some had felt that this was inevitable, but others feel that there were factors that played into the separation. However it happened, what we do know is that it was completely peaceful, and the separation of Czechoslovakia was approved on the 31st of December 1992, and on the following day, one nation split into two, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, with each country keeping the names that reflect on the people who live there. Moving on to Yugoslavia, this name comes from the Serbo-Croatian Yugoslavia, which in turn breaks down into Yug, meaning south, and Slavia, meaning the land of the Slavs, coming together to mean the land of the Southern Slavs. There had always been an idea of unifying the South Slavic nations dating back to the 17th century, and in 1918, in the fallout of World War I, the nation was first formed under the name the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. But in 1929, the king assumed dictatorship of the land and renamed it to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The nation eventually split up due to political upheaval in the early 90s, with Slovenia, the country we are most interested in for this video, becoming an independent nation in 1991. The full story and history of Yugoslavia could be a video in itself, but perhaps done by someone who deals more with historical topics. But for now, there'll be further reading down below for those of you interested. The country of Slovenia gets its name much like the way Slovakia does, from the people who live there, the Slovens, whose name was also self-appointed like the Slovaks, coming from the Slovene language word Sloveniak. The name Slovenia was not used prior to the 19th century and was coined for political reasons by Slovene nationalists. So why do these two nations have such similar names? I guess it comes down to a lot of the other similarities they have. Both nations were once part of larger nations, both countries are named after their people, and both people come from the same ethno-linguistic group, Slavs, with Slovenes however being South Slavic and Slovaks being West Slavic, with the Proto-Slavic language branching out enough between West and South Slavs to give us these two similar yet different names. Most countries tend to be known by a one-word name, like France, China, India, you guys know the drill. But even countries like these have official longer names, like Germany's full name being the Federal Republic of Germany. Yet even a name like this contains just one proper noun. Of course, this is far from the case with a place like Bosnia and Herzegovina, which despite clearly being two separate names, is actually one nation. How is it we have one country with two names? So I guess we have a few questions to unwrap here. Where do the names Bosnia and Herzegovina come from, and why does the country have both these names? The border of what's the Bosnia part of the country and what's the Herzegovina part isn't clearly defined. Bosnia covers a huge amount of the country, with primarily the southern tip of the nation being the Herzegovina area of the country. Unofficially, the division is that Herzegovina is everything south of the Ivan Planina mountain. So where does the name Bosnia come from? The first known mention of the name comes from the mid-10th century in a handbook written by Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, in which he described the small land of Bosna. Bosnia is believed to come from a hydronym, which is a fantastic word, meaning the name of a body of water. The body of water in this case being the Bosna River. So how did the river get its name? It's thought the name could go as far back as the Proto-Indo-European language root bos or bo, meaning the running water. Herzegovina's name, however, seems to have origins in the German word for duke, Herzog, which comes from the old Serbian Herceg. It comes from this word as the land of Herzegovina was originally a duchy, a land belonging to a duchess or duke, the duke in this case being the Grand Duke of Bosnia, Stepan Vučić Kosačka, who took the title of Herzog of Hum and the Coast. Hum, which was formerly known as Zaklumia, was originally a principality that lay in modern-day Herzegovina and Croatia. The land became known as the Herzogsland, and then the name we know it as today, Herzegovina. By the 15th century, Bosnia and Herzegovina were ruled by the Ottoman Empire, however eventually becoming part of Yugoslavia as the Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in the breakup and dissolution of Yugoslavia, the republic gained independence in 1992, becoming the one country with two historic names we know it as today. At first, the name/names do seem a tad odd. On the whole, we're used to seeing a country gain a new name when it's formed from two smaller land areas, such as with Tanzania, a name coming from the previous nations of Tanganyika and Zanzibar, which make up the modern day African country. Yet with Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have a nation that kept both names, as opposed to merging them to something like Bosgovina. And of course, it's not the only country to be named like this. We have Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Sao Tome and Principe, and of course Trinidad and Tobago. And to an extent, we have countries that are named after collective locations, such as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, United Arab Emirates, and of course United States of America. Luckily that last one is named of America, otherwise the nation would be called the United States of Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina. All names seem like pretty tame things. Looking into things like history and borders can sometimes bring up heaps of controversy. But how can there be anything controversial about the name of a place? Well, if you open up Google Maps, at least in the English version of Google Maps anyway, and look at the Republic of Macedonia, you will notice it has another name, Fyrom, meaning the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. While this might not seem like much at first, the name Macedonia has been a source of controversy between the country and Greece since the formation of the country in 1991, and 2 years later in 1993 when Macedonia was recognised by the UN. But why? Why do Greece seem to dislike the name Macedonia so much and use the name Fyrom instead? Heads up, this video is meant to be just informative. I'm not from Greece or the Republic of Macedonia, so don't have any personal thoughts on this subject. If you are from either of these countries and I say something that offends you or it feels like I'm putting words in your nation's mouth, I am sorry. It wasn't my intention, but just me being an uninformed, uncultured Brit. So first off, where does the name Macedonia even come from? Well, it's thought to come from this Greek word for the name of the people who inhabited the land. This name is believed to mean the Highlanders, as the residents of Macedonia lived in the more mountainous region of Greece. Wait, hold on a minute, Macedonia in Greece? I thought Macedonia was a separate country to Greece. Well, I guess now would be a good time to differentiate between all the Macedonias that have existed through history. 4 areas through history and geography have been called Macedonia. There's the modern country of the Republic of Macedonia, the ancient Kingdom of Macedonia, the modern geographical region of Macedonia that not only covers the Republic of Macedonia, but parts of Bulgaria, Albania, Serbia, and the northern part of Greece. This northern part of Greece Greece is also called the Macedonia region of Greece, which borders the actual Republic of Macedonia. The Republic of Macedonia came into being in 1991 when it gained independence from Yugoslavia, hence why it is also known as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Greece took issue with this name as they already had a region of their country too called Macedonia. The Greek region of Macedonia is thought by the Greeks to be the true Macedonia. It's where the ancient kingdom of Macedonia lay, and perhaps most importantly, it's where the ancient city of Pella was, thought to be the birthplace of a certain Alexander the Great. Greece is a country fiercely proud of its history, which is more than fair enough. Greece has an amazing history, and Greece felt that by the country using this name, they were trying to claim much of Greece's culture and heritage. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the Republic of Macedonia from opening up an airport named after Alexander the Great. So why does the Republic of Macedonia have claim to the name too? Well, there isn't one concise answer like why the Greeks don't like the name being used. It seems to come down to the land's history. The geographical land area that is considered to be Macedonia covers all of the Republic of Macedonia, and the people in the land have always considered themselves Macedonian. I think a lot of this has to do with national identity. National identity seems to be a very strong thing in this part of the world. In a survey carried out by Pew Research Center, 50% of Greeks said that being born in the country is very important to consider yourself a member of the country. I think this might be a bit of a tangent, but it's a really interesting bit of research you should check out. It will be linked in the description. Anyway, luckily this naming dispute hasn't led to any wars, but it has led to huge issues between the countries. This was perhaps most prevalent when the Republic of Macedonia first declared independence in 1991. Greece was so furious at the country using the name Macedonia that between 1991 and 1995, Greece did not recognise the country at all. Officially in Greece, the Republic of Macedonia didn't actually exist. This was a huge issue for the Republic of Macedonia, as they are a landlocked country, needing to heavily rely on Greece's ports to bring in goods and, well, survive. Luckily, Greece now accepts that the Republic of Macedonia is in fact a country, but due to this naming dispute, NATO refused Macedonia entry until this whole issue gets sorted. Thankfully, however, over the years, a better relationship has grown between the two countries. In fact, recently in context of this video coming out, the two nations have actually come to an agreement in this whole naming debacle. The country will now be known as the Republic of North Macedonia, which is great for both countries. The Republic of Macedonia get to keep their name Macedonia and shake off their Yugoslav history, and by simply adding North to their name, this creates a big enough divide in Greece's eyes between the Republic of North Macedonia and their own Macedonia. Hopefully this will be the start of a stronger relationship between these two nations, and we can live in a world where both nations are happy with each other using the name Macedonia.
Germanic origins, simply coming from the Germanic terms of Lutilla, meaning little, and Burg, meaning castle/fort. So it simply means little castle, which is actually kind of cute. It was eventually corrupted into the name of Luxembourg that we all know today. This name of Luxembourg belongs to the small nation of Luxembourg, which is just over 2,500 kilometers square in size, and has a population of around 660,000. However, this isn't the only place on our planet with the name of Luxembourg. Another Luxembourg can be found in Europe. In fact, it is right next to the actual Luxembourg. The province of Belgium that shares its border with Luxembourg is also called Luxembourg. Like, it's literally right next to it and it's simply just called Luxembourg. It's not called something like West Luxembourg or Inner/Outer Luxembourg like we see with China's Mongolia, as we talked about in a video from a few years back. Though sometimes it's referred to as Belgian Luxembourg for ease's and clarity's sake. Not only is Belgium's Luxembourg right next to the actual nation of Luxembourg, but it's actually bigger than the nation of Luxembourg, though far less populated. Belgium's province of Luxembourg is actually the largest province in the entire nation, whilst also being its least populated. So why does this part of Belgium have the exact same name as its neighbouring nation? Well, unsurprisingly, this part of Belgium actually once belonged to Luxembourg proper. Luxembourg is a nation known for being relatively on the smaller side, but nowhere near as small as micronations like the Vatican City or San Marino. The nation was actually somewhat larger in the past. The land area that would become Luxembourg gained independence in 963 AD when Count Siegfried exchanged his land in the Ardennes for a smaller strategically placed Roman fort in Central Europe. It was the land around this fort that formed in into the modern nation of Luxembourg. And yes, it's this little fort that the country derives its name from. In the past, Luxembourg had land that now belongs to France, Germany, and of course, Belgium. However, it lost these land areas over a series of partitions. The first of these partitions happened all the way back in 1659. This was in the fallout of the Franco-Spanish War. During this time, the Duchy of Luxembourg was under Spanish rule, but with the Spanish defeated by the French, a part of southern Luxembourg that belonged to Spain was given over to France and remains French to this day. The second partition happened in 1815. Prior to this, the entirety of Luxembourg had been absorbed into the French Empire under Napoleon. But in this year, the empire was defeated and left the borders of Europe in shambles. Major European powers met at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe in the aftermath of all this. It was here that it was decided that the northern part of Luxembourg would be given over to Prussia, which is now kind of Germany. It was this 1815 partition that paved the way to the third partition of Luxembourg in 1839. It was of course in this 1839 partition that resulted in Belgium claiming the western side of Luxembourg, which would become the Belgian province of the same name. Though this wasn't a case of Belgium snatching land from Luxembourg. In fact, this acquiring of Luxembourgish land coincided with the creation of the modern nation of Belgium. To understand this, we need to go back to 1815. As mentioned, Napoleon was defeated and Europe's borders were left in shambles. To fix the maps, new borders and states had to be formed from the land that was recently freed from French rule. Land liberated from France in 1815 included what are now the modern nations of the Netherlands and Belgium. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, these land areas were put together to form a state called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Yeah, the Netherlands was kind of called the UK once too. This UK was ruled by the Dutch king at the time, William I. This UK was created to be something of a buffer zone for other major European powers. It was also in 1815, during the Congress of Vienna, that another new European state was formed too, that being the German Confederation. This confederation was a collection of 39 German-speaking sovereign states united in language and culture, put in place to replace the Holy Roman Empire, which had dissolved a few years earlier in 1806. Seriously, Europe was a mess at this time. This confederation also included some larger German-speaking empires too, like Prussia and Austria. So in 1815, we had the newly formed United Kingdom of the Netherlands and the newly formed German Confederation. But where exactly does Luxembourg fit into all of this? Well, the duchy kind of belonged to both of these states. Technically, Luxembourg was part of the German Confederation, which makes sense as Luxembourg is a Germanic country with their own Germanic language of Luxembourgish. However, in a land exchange between the United Kingdom of the Netherlands and the German Confederation, King William I of the Netherlands gained control over Luxembourg and it was put into a political union with the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, while still being part of the German Confederation. It's all a bit confusing to say the least. It was also at this time that William I elevated the Duchy of Luxembourg to become the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, a title that it still has to this day. If you couldn't tell, 1815 was a pretty big year for European cartographers, but after some border shifting and land exchanges, things were somewhat settled. But these borders would only last for around 15 years, as in 1830 the land area of Belgium declared independence from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands in an event now called the Belgian Revolution. This revolution kicked off for a couple of reasons, one of those being the differences in culture between Belgium and those in the Netherlands, such as different religious beliefs and languages. Also at this time, revolution was in the air. The French Revolution of 1830 had just taken place, and after seeing that happen, the people of Belgium too wished to be free from their Dutch rulers. They had been under Dutch rule more or less without consent, and by now they were unhappy with that fact. Riots broke out in Brussels and spread across the land. This revolution even spilled over into Luxembourg. The people of Luxembourg were under quasi-Dutch control too, and were dissatisfied with how their Dutch rulers were treating them. The Luxembourgers rioted against the Dutch in their land, claiming most of the duchy minus the all-important capital city. The Dutch tried to fight back against this rioting in Belgium, but the French came to the aid of Belgium, fending off the Dutch rulers. While the revolution was a success, the Dutch would not recognize their independence until 1839, which finally brings us us back to that third partition. This third partition was part of the 1839 Treaty of London. Like with the Congress of Vienna, this was another attempt at reshaping Europe and its borders. It was at this treaty that the Dutch finally accepted Belgium's independence, thus ending the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Another aim of this treaty was to figure out what exactly to do with Luxembourg. It was still a part of the German Confederation whilst also being under Dutch rule. The Dutch actually wanted to keep it this way, but Belgian King Leopold rejected this offer. The Treaty of London finally came to the decision that Luxembourg should be shared between the two nations of Belgium and the Netherlands. The western side of Luxembourg, which amassed for over 60% of Luxembourg's entire land area and housed around half of their population, would go to Belgium, while the rest of the nation would stay under the control of the Dutch while being part of the German Confederation, as it had done before. This split fell somewhat along language lines too, as the part of Luxembourg that went to Belgium was primarily French-speaking, which fitted with the French-speaking southern Belgium, Wallonia. What doesn't seem to be too clear is how the actual people of Luxembourg felt about losing so much of their land. I've read conflicting reports that they were happy to give their Belgian allies the land, and that they weren't too thrilled about it. Luxembourg seems to be a country that for quite a long time in its history didn't have too much control over its autonomy. Who definitely were not happy about Luxembourg losing this land though were the German Confederation. They were annoyed that they had lost such a substantial amount of land. As a make good, the Duchy of London gave the German Confederation the Duchy of Limburg from the Netherlands, but that duchy has since gone back to the Netherlands and doesn't really exist as a duchy anymore anyway. The part of Luxembourg under Dutch control, however, which is the land that makes up the modern nation, would remain that way all the way until 1890. After this, it would fall into the hands of the Germans during both World Wars, until being liberated in 1945. That more or less brings us up to date on the borders of the Lowlands, and of course that part of Western Luxembourg that was given to Belgium in 1839 is that very province of Luxembourg in modern Belgium that this whole video is about. The final thing I'm left thinking about is why didn't this province end up with a new name? Like, the parts of Luxembourg that were partitioned to France and Germany aren't still called Luxembourg. Why don't we give the Belgian Luxembourg a more unique name, like West Luxembourg or South Wallonia, or just something unique entirely? The capital of Belgium's Luxembourg is called Arlon. Why don't we just name it that? There are many other instances on our globe where provinces are named after their biggest cities. But I guess if Belgium's Luxembourg had a completely different name, we wouldn't have ended up with this video. Also, I've said Luxembourg way too many times now.
This is a country with a huge variety of names. Its native speakers call it Deutschland, English speakers call it Germany, the Scandinavians call it Tyskland, France calls it Allemagne, with Spain and Portugal calling a variation on that, just to name a few. In this video, we are going to be dealing with two names for this country, perhaps the two most popular names, its English name Germany and its native name Deutschland. The name Germany has the same root as many other English words, in Latin with the Romans. It was perhaps the most famous of all the Romans that brought the name into popularity, Julius Caesar. After hearing from one ally about a tribe that lived across the Rhine that were called the Germani Clotani, which turned out to be not one tribe but a name for a collection of tribes, Caesar went on to name the land area Germania, which actually covered modern day Belgium, Netherlands and Germany. Germania eventually evolved into a name all English speakers would know it as today, Germany. Deutschland appeared as a name around the 8th century. While other nations had labelled them as Germani or Alemanni, the people of the land saw themselves as just that, people. People with their own language separate from Latin that other nations were speaking. The earliest form of the language in this region is referred to as Old High German, with one of the words of this proto-language being Judisk, referring to of the people. It was this word the natives used when naming their country, with the word eventually evolving into Deutsch and the country's name to Deutschland. I'd highly recommend watching the great video Why Are There So Many Different Names for Germany by Erika Onkrem. It's an amazing video and I feel like talking about the subject anymore in this video will just feel like stealing content from that one. Seriously guys, it's a really good video.
That teeters on the edge of Europe and Asia. It has a population of just under 3 million people and is just under 30,000 square miles in size. It's an incredibly ancient nation, with its capital being one of the oldest inhabited cities on the planet, even outdating the Roman Empire, and the former kingdom where the nation now stands is believed to be the first place to adopt Christianity. They also apparently have the longest non-stop double-track cable car, and chess is part of the school curriculum, just to share some lighter, less grandiose facts about this nation. I'm of course talking about none other than the nation of Armenia. Here in England, we called this nation just that, Armenia, and many other languages use a variation of this name, from the French Armeni, the Slovak Armenesko, the Japanese Armenia, and even the Turkish Ermenistan, which while seems quite different, is still similar to Armenia. However, there is of course one nation in particular that uses a name that sounds nothing like the name Armenia. They use a different name entirely. Unsurprisingly, I'm talking about Armenia themselves. In the nation of Armenia, and in their official language of Armenian, the country is called Hayestan. There's a couple of points of interest with the name Hayestan. First being the central point of this video, that it's completely different to Armenia. However, the second thing I find interesting about this name is the second half of it, the stan suffix. This is a geographic naming convention that is commonplace in this part of the world. All the other stan nations such as Kazakhstan, Tajikistan and Afghanistan are just across the Caspian Sea from the nation. Under its native name of Hayestan, Armenia can be seen as a secret 8th stan nation, which is why I almost called this video for clickbait reasons. Anyway, how did this nation that names itself Hayestan end up with the name Armenia pretty much everywhere else on the planet? Why is Hayestan called Armenia in English? And oh boy, this isn't a question I've asked myself in regards to an entire nation since April 2017. Sorry to keep you waiting. Though before we look into these two names, they aren't actually the only names this nation goes by. There's actually more. One of these other names are Naili, which is the name of a collection of tribes that lived in this area in ancient times. Apparently, sometimes this name is used for the nation in a poetic/patriotic sense. There's also the incredibly ancient name of Ararat/Urartu, which comes from Babylonian, though it seems this name is only really used in historical context. Though a name for the nation that's commonly used that isn't either Armenia or Hayestan is Sumketi, the name used in the neighbouring Georgia and other Caucasus languages. This name supposedly comes from an adaptation of an old Akkadian name from the area, Sumu. This really is a nation of a lot of names. But today our main focus is with just the two names of Armenia and Hayestan, and let's start off with that native name of Hayestan. As we mentioned, the latter half of this name is a popular, well-established nation name suffix. We have a whole video about the stan suffix and what it means and where it comes from, but just to refresh, it derives ultimately from Persian and means things along the lines of place of/country of. It makes a lot of sense for this suffix to pop up here. As I mentioned, it's just across the sea from the other stan nations, and Persian seems to have had an influence in the nation. So while we may understand the stan part of this name, what about the former higher part? Well, we aren't exactly sure. This is an incredibly ancient part of the world, and unfortunately we just don't know. Too much time has passed and a clear answer evades our knowledge. Though that doesn't mean we are totally in the dark on this one. We have a selection of ideas as to where the name Hayestan may have come from. One of those ideas being that it comes from an older name of Hatti, which means the land of the Hittites. The Hittites were another ancient tribe of people who once upon a time lived in this land. This etymology does of course make sense, as naming places after tribes is a very popular way to name somewhere. What's also a popular way of naming places is by naming them after geographical features, and once there was an area close to the Armenian highlands called Hayasa, which too seems like a logical origin of the name Hayestan. However, without a shadow of a doubt, the most popular idea as to where the name comes from has it relating to not a tribal people or geographic feature, but instead it relates to just one person, that being Haik Nahapet, also known as Haik the Great, the legendary founding father of the nation. Sometimes the nation's name in its native tongue is seen as simply being Haik. That's how important his role is in this land. How Haik came to be the nation's founding father is detailed in a legend first recorded by Armenian historian Moses of Cholin. The story goes that Haik and many people fled Assyria, which was under the rule of a fierce person who I've seen be called either Bel the Giant or King Belus. Let's just presume this is a giant king called Bel. Haik settled in the land what eventually was named after him. However, Bel was unhappy about this and sent an envoy to demand Haik return. Of course, Haik refused to come back, which enraged Bel. So the giant king sent an army of his fellow giants to take down the rebel. This led to a great war between Hayek and his fellow rebels and Bel and his giants, which culminated in Hayek using his longbow to land a far, near impossible blow to King Bel, which instantly killed him. The rest of the giants fled, and Hayek and his followers were the victors, allowing them to settle this land without any evil giant kings breathing down their neck. And of course, the land settled by Hayek was named after him, becoming Hayestan, as it's known as today. etymology. It's a neat story, and while it's more folktale than concrete history, it's easy to understand why it has remained so popular and has become the go-to explanation for the nation's origin and etymology. At its core, it's David versus Goliath, the big evil ruler versus the little guy, a triumphant underdog. It's a tale of huge importance in Hayestan, but if it's so important, then why isn't the name and variations of the name used across the globe? Why has pretty much the rest of the planet been left with the name Armenia for this nation? Well, if you thought that we were clutching at straws for the origin of Hayestan, we seem to be even less sure as to where the name Armenia comes from. Most sources that seemingly talk about its origin like to first state that the etymology is fundamentally unknown. As mentioned before, this part of the world is incredibly old, and usually the further back somewhere's history goes, the less we know about it. Though like with the name of Hayestan, we have a selection of ideas as to where the name Armenia may come from. The top contenders for languages where the name may come from are seemingly Greek and or Persian. The oldest written recording we have of the name is in Persian on the Behistun inscription, which is some ancient text carved into a cliff in western Iran. The inscription uses the old Persian name of Armenia, however it also mentions other names to the land, including the name Harmenuia from the now extinct Elamite language and the ancient Babylonian name of Urashotu, which went into the creation of that other ancient name for the land that we still use in historical contexts, which I mentioned earlier. This text may date back to sometime between 500 to 400 BC, so it shows us that the land has had vastly different names in different languages for quite some time. As for what ideas we have about Armenia's etymology, well, one of them is that it simply comes from the Proto-Indo-European Ala root word, which means to assemble, which is a nice enough sentiment to name a piece of land after, I suppose. Another idea is that it's a corruption of the older name of Harmini, which means mountainous region of the Mini, with the Mini being another name for a tribe of people more commonly known as the Manians. This name of Harmini apparently comes up in the Bible as the name for this land, and it also relates to the aforementioned name of Harmenuia from the extinct Elamite language. However, once again, the most popular theory as to where the name Armenia comes from relates to a legendary figure, though I must admit there's actually two legendary figures that have been credited with being the namesake of Armenia. The most popular idea for a person who gets credited with being the namesake of Armenia is with a legendary figure called Alam. Alam is another legendary hero of Armenian folklore, and he relates to the Hayestan namesake too. Quite literally, Aram is seen as a far-flung descendant of Hayek the Great. One source told me he is the great-grandson of Hayek's great-grandson, whatever that means. Legends about Aram also say that all modern Armenians can trace their lineage back to him, so you can understand why the nation would be named after this gentleman. While this idea might seem pretty conclusive, a man called Alam, who is the descendant of Hayek, created the name Armenia, there is another idea, and another legendary figure who the land could be named after. This idea relates more to Greece and to the Greek language. Supposedly by the end of the 2nd millennium BC, a tribe migrated south from the north of the Balkans down to the lands of Armenia. They settled here and started to intermix with the people already there. The Greeks called this North Balkan tribe the Armen, so in turn the Greeks named this land after the tribe they saw claim it. And supposedly the leader of this Armen tribe, who they themselves are named after, was a man either named Armenios or Armenos. I've seen both names used. He was supposedly one of the Argonauts too, as in the Jason / Goldfleece / fight stop motion skeletons kind of Argonauts. So having your nation named after one of the legendary Argonauts is pretty darn cool in my eyes. And while this Argonaut etymology doesn't seem to be as well known or supported, I feel it explains to us so much better as to why this name of Armenia has become so popular outside the nation, as opposed to their own name of Hayestan. This theory puts the Greek language as the creator of this name, and the Greek language influenced so much, including the Latin language, which led to Rome using the name Armenia too. And of course, Latin went on to shape so many languages that spread across the globe. Though that isn't meant to completely discredit the Aram etymology. In fact, I completely understand why this etymology is the most popular answer when it comes to explaining Armenia's name. Like the Hayek etymology, it's a neat story to get behind. There's just something really cool about the names of two legendary figures, both from the same family and both with huge importance in their homeland, being the namesake for the nation's two most popular names, Hayestan Hayestan and Armenia.
Greece, home of smash plates, Zeus and countless English tourists. Seriously, I'm sorry guys, but it's your fault for having such a lovely country. And while speaking of the English, all the English speaking world calls the land of ouzo and philosophy Greece. You know, like the goo. Yet in Greece, Greece isn't called Greece, it's called Hellas. I'm sure you know the drill by now guys. So why is Hellas called Greece in English? So, first off, let's just say that Greece isn't even called Greece in the English language. Its official English name is the Hellenic Republic in relation to its Greek name Hellas. Yet, I'm sure most people would look at you with glazed eyes if you called it that as opposed to Greece, so let's stick with Greece. The key reason as to why the land is called Greece in one language and Hellas in another is due to the word roots. Greece's root is in Latin and Hellas's root is in Greek, by some surprise. Greece comes from the Romans with the Latin terms Graecus and Glacians. In mythology, Graecus was the son of Zeus and he was supposedly the namesake for the Glacian tribe of ancient Greeks. The Glacians are believed to be the first Greeks to colonize Italy. They were primarily in the coastal area of southern Italy. These Greeks were most likely the first Greeks Latin speakers ever came across, which led to all Greek people being named after the Glacians in Latin, calling the people the Glaci and the lands Glacia, which over time evolved into the English name Greece. The name Hellas, however, seems to throw up a lot more confusion and less clear-cut origins. One etymology tells us it means the land of sun and stone in Greek. It's also believed to have come from the mythological character Helen. His name is believed to not only be the source for the name Hellas, but he's believed to be the forefather to the Greek people as a whole. In Homer's Iliad, the tribe led by Achilles were called Hellenes and Hellas too, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to believe that the country was named after him. So in the same way Greece got its name from its people, the Greeks, Hellas too got its name from its people, the Hellenes. Also, this Helen has nothing to do with the one of Troy, just to save confusion. Yet, Greece seems to have a second name in Greece too, Elafa. Without being Greek myself, I find it hard to figure out when to use what term. In example, the Greek national football team are called Ethniki Elafos, clearly using the Elafa name, but they're controlled by the Hellenic Football Federation. From what I can gather, and with the help of some friendly redditors and friends of friends, the difference in names are used under different circumstances. Hellas is the more formal traditional name that you'd write down, and Elafa is used on a more day-to-day basis. Elafa in Greek looks a little like this, and while it looks like it starts with an E, the squiggle that looks like an apostrophe to you and me actually indicates that there should be a breathy h sound before the vowel. So Elafa can be pronounced like Helafa, explaining the origins of the two names. If you are Greek, then chime in down below in the comments about these two names for your country, and if you've made it to the end of this video, then Oppa and Yamas to you. That's pretty much the only Greek I know.
It's a nation located in Central/Southeast Europe. It resides primarily across the northeastern coast of the Adriatic Sea and shares land borders with Slovenia, Hungary, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. The nation is home to around 4 million people with an area of just over 20,000 miles squared. Is it part of the Balkans? Well, that seems to be somewhat debated, and the general consensus is that parts of this nation sit within the Balkans Peninsula. It is also a staggeringly beautiful country, with places like Split, the island of Kirk, and Dubrovnik especially, looking like locations ripped straight out of a fantasy series or something. The nation was also home to the largest truffle ever found, up until 2014 when the record was beaten. This seriously seems to be a point of pride in Croatia, and rightfully so I suppose. I feel Croatia's biggest claim to fame should be its incredible determination to make sure that Bosnia and Herzegovina got as minimal coastline as possible. In many languages around the world, this country is called Croatia, like in English, or has a name of a similar sound. Take the French name of Croatie, or the German name of Croatian, or the Hindi name of Croatia, or even the Japanese name of Croatia. All these names sound very similar to that name of Croatia. However, a name sounding like this isn't universal for the nation. Many languages use a name for Croatia that sounds nothing like Croatia. The most noticeable example of this being the official language of the nation itself, Croatian. Yep, in Croatian, Croatia isn't called Croatia. It is instead called Horvatska.
This name of Horvatska looks and sounds nothing like the name of Croatia. This is something in language called an endonym and an exonym. An endonym is the native name for a location used by its native speakers, whereas an exonym is the name used for that area by non-native speakers. So in this case, Horvatska is the endonym and Croatia is the exonym. Croatia is far from the only country to have different names in different languages. There's Deutschland and Germany, Suomi and Finland, and so on. The early days of Name Explain had a strong focus on these kinds of names, but I haven't talked about them in years, so it felt right to highlight them again. Anyway, Croatian isn't the only language to use a name for the country along the lines of Horvatska. The languages of Slovenian, Serbian, and Bosnian all use similar names to Horvatska to refer to the country of Croatia. You would probably notice this, but there is something of a link between these nations that use Horvatska sounding names. The languages mentioned of Croatian, Slovenian, Serbian, and Bosnian are all Slavic languages. It seems that Slavic languages tend to favor names that sound like Horvatska, though there are non-Slavic languages that use Horvatska-inspired names, such as the Turkish name for Croatia of Hrvatistan, or the Hungarian name of Horvatország. I imagine these kinds of names came about due to geographic closeness to Croatia, as opposed to linguistic closeness. What's perhaps most interesting, however, is that many other Slavic languages use names for the country that seem like something of a hybrid between the names of Croatia and Horvatska. Take the Czech name for the country of Horvatsko, or the Polish name of Horvatia. These names that sound like a weird mixture of Croatia and Horvatska aren't some weird human-made construct made to try and please everybody. There is a reason that they sound like both names, and that's because the names of Croatia and Horvatska are very much linked together. In fact, they are the exact same name. Often when it comes to endonyms and exonyms, the names are completely different with different origins and etymologies. The aforementioned examples of Germany and Deutschland are a great example of that. These two names mean completely different things with different origins entirely. This is not the case with Croatia and Horvatska, however. These are the same word with the same meaning, just translated into different languages. In fact, what would be more fitting to say is that Croatia is just the English translation of the name Horvatska. Yeah, Horvatska is the original form of this name before it was changed into Croatia, which makes sense considering it's the native name for the land. It would be strange if the name outsiders used came first and the natives adapted it, though countries having names given to them by non-natives isn't an entirely novel concept, I suppose. This name of Horvatska simply means the land of the Croats, with Croats being the name of this land's native inhabitants, or as the Croats are called in their native Croatian, the Horvati. Understanding that the Croats are called the Horvati in their native language should help make the name of Horvatska make a tad more sense. We can see these people's names in the former part of the name Horvatska. I believe the ska at the end is a Slavic name forming element meaning land / land of. We see in the native name of another Slavic speaking nation too, that being Poland and their native name of Polska. This means that the English name of Croatia also means the land of the Croats too, and this is probably much easier to figure out, I imagine, for many of us. We can clearly see their name at the start of this name, and the ever-present ear suffix means land of, as many of you know, I'm sure. So while we know the country's name means land of the Horvati / Croats, what we aren't so sure about is how exactly the Horvati got their name to begin with. Obviously we know it would have been Horvati initially before being translated into Croats, but beyond that we really aren't too sure. The name is pretty old, most likely coming from the Middle Ages, and annoyingly sometimes this kind of information was never fully recorded or kept track of. Linguists over the years, however, have come up with some potential ideas as to what the name of Horvati might mean and where it came from. Wikipedia has a whole heap of these ideas, and while we won't highlight all of them, we will focus on a select few. One idea is that it means tree, perhaps in relation to the Horvati living amongst the trees. Another idea is that it means ranger or Highlander, or that it means freedom or to cut or strike. One idea is that it means well armed or warriors clad with horns, but those ideas aren't thought to be as accurate by today's standards. One of the more popular theories, however, is that it means mountains, relating to the Russian word for mountain chains. I'm sure you get the idea. We really have a minimal clue where exactly the name Horvati came from, but people have had a good crack at it. What we really know for sure is that they did have this name, and eventually their land got named after them, adopting that name of Horvatska that it still has today. So who was it that turned Horvatska into the name of Croatia? Well, it was of course the Romans and their Latin. The land area that is now Croatia came under Roman rule in 32 BC and stayed under Roman rule until around 480 AD. This makes sense as the land is just across the water from the Italian peninsula. Croatia played a large role in the history of Rome too, perhaps most noticeably one of the few emperors who actually retired as opposed to died or was killed. Diocletian retired to the city of Split, which is in modern day Croatia. His palace is still one of the city's most popular landmarks. While they had the land that makes up modern Croatia, they didn't actually call it Croatia to begin with, nor did they call it Horvatska. Instead, they named it Dalmatia in relation to another tribe who lived in this area. To this day, an area of Croatia is still called Dalmatia. By the time the name of Horvati and Horvatska had come into use in the Middle Ages, the Western Roman Empire was long gone, and Latin had transformed into medieval Latin / Vulgar Latin. This was a more corrupt form of Latin spoken across Europe at this time. In fact, most modern Romance languages like French and Spanish actually derived from Vulgar Latin, as opposed to the proper OG Latin. At this time, Vulgar Latin was being used as something of a lingua franca across all of Europe, even in parts of the continent that didn't use Romance languages, like in Slavic-speaking parts of the continent. Now, Slavic languages and Romance languages are two very different kettles of fish. Each language featured different sounds and letter orders to each other, which wouldn't fly in the other language. When Latin speakers came across words that didn't fit neatly into their language, they adapted them so they could, and Horvatska is a clear example of that. This word of Horvatska didn't gel with Latin speakers at all for a variety of reasons. I mean, just look at it. A cluster of 3 consonants at the start of the word is unheard of in most Romance languages. One of the biggest issues was the first letter, the H. H has a strange history with Latin, from being pronounced to being silent in different time periods. By the Middle Ages, it seems that Vulgar Latin speakers were not pronouncing H's. This meant that Latin speakers who encountered this name had to do some altering to it so they could even pronounce it. The first thing they did was add a C to the start of it. CH was a much more acceptable way of starting a word in Latin, so this made the name more manageable. This gave us the name of Slovatska, though as the H was silent, it disappeared and gave us Chlovatska. The next issue this name faced for Latin speakers was that V between the R and the A. V's do not really appear all that often like this in Latin, making it difficult to say to Latin speakers. To combat this issue, the V was replaced with a vowel to make the word easy to say for Latin speakers. The vowel was of course an O. With this change, you will see we have already arrived at the name of Klotska. The final thing that Latin speakers needed to do was replace the Slavic Landov suffix, ska, with their own Landov suffix, ia, and bingo, we have the name Croatia. This name of Croatia stuck around in Vulgar Latin and made its way across Europe, being adapted into the various forms of the name that we mentioned up top. The nation of Croatia itself, however, stuck with that name of Hrvatska, while over the years since the Middle Ages, the land of Croatia found itself under a variety of different rulers, from the dual monarchy to being part of Yugoslavia, but it held on to that name, using it when the nation took on its modern form in 1991. Despite the fact that the names of Croatia and Hrvatska seem so different at first glance, when we take it step by step to see how one name transformed into another, we can see the change fairly clearly. So, why is Hrvatska called Croatia in English? Well, it's basically because Latin speakers couldn't be bothered to figure out how to pronounce it.
The continental nation of Georgia lies within both Eastern Europe and Western Asia in the Caucasus region of the world. It's just under 27,000 square miles in size and has a population of just over 4 million. It's the birthplace of wine, with the oldest evidence of its production being found in the land. The deepest cave in the world can also be found in Georgia too. And famous people from the country include the likes of actor Elena Satin, chess grandmaster Zurab Amaspalashvili, and a guy named Joseph Stalin, who you may have heard of before. Georgia is far from the most well-known of country on the world stage, but from all accounts it seems like a pretty remarkable one. The name Georgia is fairly common for this country in other languages, albeit they have their own spin on it.
In German it is called Georgen, while in French it is called Georgie. Even in Japanese it is called Georgia. This name or variations of it are commonplace across the globe, though where you won't find a version of this name is within Georgia itself. In the land's native tongue of Georgian, the nation is instead called Sakartvelo. This name even extends to the native names of the people of the land and their language. The name for its residents in English are Georgians, while in the country they refer to themselves as Kartveli, and they call their language of Georgian Kartuli. This is a very unique language as it's not of Indo-European roots or even Afro-Asiatic roots like many of the other languages spoken around it. The language is instead the most widely spoken member of the Kartvelian language family, which houses much smaller languages like Maz, Mingrelian and Svan. This family even has its own unique scripture that consists of 3 different writing systems. But suffice to say, the names of Georgia and Sakartvelo sound nothing alike. This is another prime example of a nation's endonym and its English exonym not matching up at all, like we see with Germany and Deutschland, Finland and Suomi, and the many others we've covered on this channel over the years. Seriously, how have we not done this one yet? It must have slipped under my radar or something. Between these two names, Sakartvelo is definitely the older of the two. The earliest evidence we have of the name comes from the 8th century. It has ties with the name of the locals. As mentioned, they refer to themselves as the Kartveli. We don't seem to be entirely sure as to where the name for these people came from, but the popular myth is that they are descendants of Katlos, a figure in Christianity who is seen as the founder of these people. He was also the great-great-grandson of Noah, you know, the guy of the ark. However their name came about, it can be seen in that name of Sakartvelo, though it's not a perfect one-to-one. In the country's name, the letters of S and A are added to the start of it, and the I at the end of Kartveli is instead changed to an O. These changes came about due to how words are formed in Georgian. The S, A and O are their way of changing the name of a people into the name of a location, kind of like the ia, land or stan suffixes in other languages. This means that the name Sakartvelo more or less simply means the land of the Kartveli. The name Sakartvelo was initially used to refer to the more central region of the modern nation, where the Kartveli initially originated from. Over time, as the Kartveli became the dominant group in the land, and their land and influence expanded, it came to refer to the wider region as a whole, before settling as the name of the nation today. So despite how exotic the name Sakartvelo might seem initially to English speakers, in reality it's a fairly basic name that derives from the tried and tested formula of using a people's name as a place name with an affix. Perhaps in an alternative timeline, outside people interacted more with the Kartveli and named the land after them too, with their own place name forming suffixes. Maybe it could have become known as Kartvelia or Kartveliland or even Kartvelistan, though this of course did not happen. Instead, tongues around the globe settled on the name Georgia for this country, or at least a variation of that name in their respective languages. Our earliest evidence for this name in any form dates back to just 1320, and I say 1320 like that was yesterday, but relative to the name Sakartvelo, which came about in the 8th century, it seems pretty new. This 1320 appearance of the name can be found on a world map created by Italian cartographer Pietro Visconti. Now, you must remember at this time, we didn't have a full grasp of what the world really looked like. Wider European knowledge of the Americas was still a few centuries away. Even Africa and Asia hadn't been fully uncovered yet by European map makers. I preface this so much because the map he made in 1320 looked like this. I'm sure this map was pretty good for its time, and I'm not discrediting Visconti's abilities as a map maker, but with our understanding of the world today, this map more looks like something you'd find at the start of a fantasy book or something. Supposedly Georgia is on here somewhere, but I've spent way too much time looking for it, and I don't have the time to fully track it down. If anyone can pinpoint it, please let me know down below. Supposedly on this map, the land is labelled not as Georgia, but instead by its older Italian name of Georgia. This might seem odd to us now, but G and J have been interchangeable throughout history. Despite only receiving this name in the 14th century, the land has been known of by Europeans for centuries prior. In fact, during the time of ancient Rome when the land was under their rule, they gave it the name of Iberia. This is super odd, as Iberia is also the name for the peninsula in southwest Europe, which houses Spain, Portugal, and some other smaller nations and areas too. Why did the Romans use this name for two different parts of the world? beats me. Honestly, that could be a video for another time. Though of course the name Iberia was ditched for this land and it became known as Georgia in Old Italian, which spread across Europe and other nations before becoming Georgia in English. We have a few theories as to where this name originates from. It's thought to ultimately not actually come from any European language, but instead from Persian roots. In Persian, this land and its people were simply known as Gurgun and Gurg respectively. There are two leading theories on what this name could mean. The duller answer is that it means the tillers of the land. This relates to the unique way of farming that the natives did here. This farming clearly confused ancient Persian speakers enough to warrant naming the people and the land after this fact. The second theory is a lot more exciting and has the name meaning the land of the wolves. This probably stems from the fact that wolves can be found in this country. Today, there are thought to just be a few thousand left here, but we can imagine in the past they were much more abundant. Wolves are pretty cool animals, often linked with might and ferocity. I can imagine many people in the land like this etymology better, as being linked with wolves and being the land of them is just pretty rad. The name might not relate to wolves as a whole, but instead just one mythological creature called the Gurg, which supposedly had the head of a wolf. No idea what the rest of its body looked like though. Whatever Gurgun truly means is a mystery, but we have a pretty good understanding as how this Persian name became Georgian in English, and versions of that name across Europe. It's believed that Gurgun became Georgia via Christian missionaries and explorers who went to this land. Those from Western Europe would have heard this name for the country and brought tales of the land back westward with them. By the 14th century, Georgia was already a very Christian country. In fact, it is still incredibly Christian to this very day. Georgia was one of the first nations to adopt Christianity as their official language, happening in 319 AD, even before Rome had adopted it. And for those wondering, nearby Armenia is seen as being the first to actually adopt it back in 301. As these European Christian missionaries knew the land was Christian, and most likely had the religion on the brain themselves, they supposedly mistook the name of Gurgun as an ode to one St. George. St. George is a big deal in Christianity. He is being considered the saint of many countries, including England where he supposedly killed a big dragon. He has since become linked with Georgia too. It's why the flags of England and Georgia are fairly alike. Once again, we don't actually know if Gurgun is really an ode to St. George, but this was the idea that European explorers liked most, so when they went back to places like Italy and England, it was this etymology they took back with them, which cemented the land with being somewhere deeply linked with St. George and gave them the name of Georgia, which has since been translated into many other languages around the world. One of the more notable translations of the name Georgia is Gluzia, the Russian version of the name, as well as versions of it being used in other Slavic languages. There's some debate whether this is the Slavic translation of Georgia or if the name came about by other means, but either way this name has become deeply linked with the nation. This is because the nations of Russia and Georgia have had very close ties throughout history. As mentioned up top, one of Russia's most well-known leaders came from the land. On top of this, Georgia throughout its history has been part of not only the Russian Empire, but also the USSR. As the country was under Russian influence for so long, it meant that the Russian name of Gluzia became known across the world too. The nation hasn't been part of Russia or the USSR since 1991 however, when they gained independence. Since this time, the government of Georgia has politely asked other nations to stop referring to it by this name, as they really do not want any ties with Russia anymore. But this all explains to us why this nation is called Georgia, or a variation of it in most parts of the world. But within the nation itself, it goes by that name of Sakartvelo. Its endonym is simply an ode to the natives of the land, while its exonym is potentially a misconstrued Persian ode to a Christian saint who fought a dragon one time. Yet in the same way the countries asked other nations to stop calling it Gluzia, maybe one day in the future it will ask all nations to stop calling it Georgia and instead ask everywhere to refer to it by its endonym of Sakartvelo. That's just me hypothesizing, but we have seen it recently with Turkey asking the world to call it Turkiya, so who knows. At the very least, it would save a lot of us confusing it with a certain US state.
Somewhat smaller country with a population of around 3 million and a land area of about 11,000 square miles tucked away in the Balkans Peninsula, bordered by Greece, North Macedonia, Kosovo and Montenegro. It also seems to be having a bit of a tourism boom at the moment, which is understandable. Its coast looks incredible and its capital of Tirana seems like the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. What I however think is the most interesting thing about this land is the language spoken there, Albanian.
Albanian. Being a part of the Balkans, you may think that Albania would use a Slavic tongue or even have similarities with the neighbouring Greek language, but that isn't the case at all. Albanian has no relation to Greek or any Slavic language or even any Romance or Germanic language. While Albania is part of the Indo-European language family, along with the Germanic, Slavic and Romance languages, it has no connection to any of them. It sits on its own separate branch of this language tree. It probably did once upon a time have sibling languages like many other branches of this family do, but they have since all seemingly died off. The only other two languages that stand alone on the Indo-European language tree today are Greek and Armenian, which too have no living relatives to speak of. What makes things even more impressive with Albanian is the fact that it has stayed so unique, despite the many foreign powers that have claimed rule over this land. Over history, the landmass that makes up modern Albania has been ruled by various powers, including the Thracians, the Greeks, the Romans and the Byzantines, and even the Ottomans. They only proclaimed independence from the Ottomans in 1912, little over 100 years ago. Yet despite this, they held on to the language and it didn't receive much influence from these other languages. This is starkly different to my own tongue of English, which was influenced by literally every other language that arrived on the island of Great Britain. The little flirt. This uniqueness of the Albanian language is even reflected in the Albanian name for the nation too. In most languages, this country is called Albania, or some slight alteration of that name. Take the French Albany, or the German Albanian, or the Greek Albania, or even the Japanese Arubania. In most parts of the world, this country has a familiar name, but the uniqueness of the Albanian language means that Albania has a completely different native name. It is instead called Shqiperia, sometimes spelled and translated as Shqipëri too, but we'll be using the former name in this video. This name is of course very different to the name of Albania and its worldwide alterations, though this makes all the sense in the world. As mentioned, Albania has no relation with any other Indo-European language, so why would it share its name with any of these other languages? Funnily enough, this is a similar case to the other two Indo-European languages with no living relatives. They also have names that are unique to their language, with Armenia being called Hayestan in Armenian and Greece being called Hellas/Alada in Greek. So how did Albania, which is more or less universally known as Albania, end up with the name of Shqiperia in its native tongue? It's probably a tad more sensible to start by looking at the name of Albania first, as that's the name many people are much more familiar with. Like many nations in Europe, the name Albania is a product of the Romans. The Romans had a habit of naming land areas after the groups of people they found living in that land, like how Britannia was named after the Bretonnic people, and how the name Greece comes from the Greci people. These were respectively the first tribes the Romans made contact with in their respective lands and named the entire land after these people, despite the fact that other people were living in these lands too, and the fact that the people these lands were named after didn't have rule over the entirety of the lands. This is why many countries in Europe have a name meaning the land of so-and-so, whether it be with the ear suffix meaning land of, or the more literal land suffix. This is of course the case with the name Albania too. We can see the ear suffix at the end there. When the Romans first entered this land, the first tribe they met were ones called the Albanoi. So the name Albania simply means the land of the Albanoi. The Albanoi were an Illyrian tribe who inhabited this land. Their home city has been dubbed Albanopolis. While we aren't sure where this city was, some scholars believe that it was located in one of two villages in modern day Albania. The name Albania was first recorded in around 150 AD by Roman geographer Ptolemy. At this time, however, the land of modern-day Albania was in the Roman province of Macedon, so the Romans must have coined this name of Albania prior to the formation of this province and then integrated it into this larger province. The name the Romans used was Albania, which is exactly the same as the modern English name, as well as how it's spelled in other languages. It's impressive that some of the words used by Romans thousands of years ago are still in common use to this day with little to no alteration. So while we know that Albania's name comes from the Albanoi, where exactly did the name of the Albanoi come from? Well, here's the thing. We don't know where the name Albanoi comes from. This is a name belonging to a very ancient group of people who didn't seem to record the origin of their name. And even if they did record it, that information has been long lost. We do thankfully have some theories on the origin of the name Albanoi, but they're little more than just ideas. The main ideas is that it might derive from one of two Proto-Indo-European words. One idea is that it might come from the PIE Alb, meaning hill. This would relate to the landscape of Albania. This is also thought to be the origin of the Alps too, which are also fairly large hills. The other idea is that it comes from the PIE Albhol, which means white, once again relating to the white snow of the mountains of the region. What's interesting about this latter theory on the origin of the Albanoi's name is that it ties the name Albania to the name of another European country on literally the opposite side of the continent. That being Scotland. Scotland, in its native Scottish Gaelic language, goes by the name of Alba. This once again relates to the whitened snow of the land, though Alba was initially named for Britain as a whole before being linked to just Scotland. Whatever the case, if like me you were wondering if there was a link between the name Albania and the Scottish name for Scotland of Alba, the answer is there might be. While that explains to us where the name of Albania comes from, what about the native name of Shqiperia? This name has a very different origin and doesn't actually relate to a tribe of people at all. The name means the land of eagles, coming from the Albanian word for the bird, Shqiponia. Eagles have become a key part of the national identity of Albania and are celebrated with pride. There's even a two-headed one on their flag. The two-headed eagle, however, is a symbol that stretches way beyond Albania. It is a symbol of power and strength, dating back thousands of years and seen in places like ancient Greek and the Byzantine Empire. More specifically linked to Albania, however, is a myth deeply linked with the nation and its origin and the origin of that name, and even involves an eagle. Not a two-headed one, however. The story goes that a long time ago, a young man was hunting in the mountains and saw a large eagle flying over his head with a snake in its mouth. The boy was curious and tracked down the nest of this eagle. At the nest, the boy saw there was an eagle chick in the nest, along with the snake the mother had brought it for food. The snake wasn't actually dead, however, and it seems that instead of the chick eating the snake was going to eat the chick. Feeling compassion to save the baby eagle, the boy stepped in to save the day. The boy drew one of his hunting arrows and took the snake out, then took the baby eagle home with him. On his way home, however, the mother eagle flew down and asked why he had taken her baby. The boy explained that he had taken the baby because it wasn't safe. The eagle bargained with the boy. She wanted her baby back and in return would give the boy the sight and strength of an eagle, which he accepted. With these powers, the young boy grew to be strong and became something of a legend in the land. Even the eagle he saved grew up to be his own hunting partner. The locals loved this legend so much, they dubbed him the son of the eagle and named their land the land of the eagles. This is of course quite a tall tale to say the least, but all these kinds of myths start in a grain of truth. Whatever the case, this is the story that many believe led to the country being named after eagles. So it seems that the reason why Shqiperia is named Albania in English and many other languages is because while the wider world follows the suit of the Romans and named the land after one of the tribes of people found there, the natives of the land wanted to take a different approach. They wanted their land to be named after their national animal and tie it into one of their popular mythological stories. They wanted their land to be named after their own symbol of pride. However, there is one other story on where the name Shqiperia comes from. There isn't much evidence on this theory, but I enjoy it nonetheless, hence why I'm covering it here at the end. One idea is that the name Shqiperia comes from an Albanian word, which means to speak intelligibly. This idea for the origin of the name Shqiperia ties into the Albanian language and its uniqueness. I can just imagine some ancient Albanians using their language, which is different to literally every other language around them, and deciding that theirs, and only theirs, is the intelligible one.
This country is pretty much universally known as Finland, or at least a variation on that, such as Finlandia in Italian, Finsko in Czech, and Finlando in Japanese. While of course these names are spelt and pronounced differently, none of them stray too far from Finland. The Finnish, however, call their own country Suomi, and the only country that calls it Suomi is Suomi, with Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia calling it variations of that. While some countries have a huge variety of names in different languages, why does pretty much the whole world call Finland Finland except for Finland. The first recording of the name Finland are on runestones found in Sweden and on Gotland, one of Sweden's islands. The runestone on the mainland of Sweden spelt the name Finlanti, and the Gotland runestone translates the name to Finlandi. Both these runes are thought to commemorate people who had died in Finland. The Finland these ancient runes talk about, however, don't mean the entire land area we now know as Finland, but rather a small area of the modern country in the southwest, now known as the historical province of Finland proper. While we have no definitive proof, some believe Finn comes from the word fen, the Proto-Germanic word for marsh/swampland, as Finland has a lot of marshland. It seems more likely, however, that Finland means just that, the land of the Finns. Finns being the people who lived in this area. Where the names Finns came from, however, is something of a mystery, as historical information for Northern Europe is scarce at best, and these names appear far and few between in written form. Theories on the etymology of the name Finns, including meaning in Fennoscandian, hunter-gatherers, that originates from the Old High German words Finfian, Fanfian and Fend, meaning find, try and wander respectively, and Norse sagas from the 11th to 14th century that use words like Finia and Finas, but uses them inconsistently. It's just unfortunately one of those questions we'll never fully know the answer to. Its Finnish name Suomi is unfortunately just as unclear in origin, but the most popular theory being is that it comes from the Proto-Baltic word zemlja, which translates to land/ground and even earth. Another theory for the name is it deriving from the Sami people who live in the Lapland part of Finland, but that idea is considered outdated. When I run into dead ends or vague answers for videos, it really makes me want to bang my head on the wall, but this is just a side effect of working with ancient history, and I suppose a reminder for just how little we know in some aspects about the planet we all live on. Up one of two things in your mind: the country that is simultaneously in Europe and Asia, the home of the remains of the city of Troy, and kebabs, saviour of the Saturday night, or that angry looking chicken thing that are eaten in their millions over Christmas, Easter and Thanksgiving. Oh man, all this turkey and kebab talk is making this veggie question his life decisions, but nevertheless, you'd be right to think of either of these things when you hear the name Turkey, as Turkey is not only the name for a nation, but the name of a bird. But how did it come to be the name for both these things? So while one of the biggest debates on earth is what came first, the chicken or the egg, for this video we need to ask what came first, the turkey or the turkey? Well, it's kinda hard to give one definitive answer. The majority of the land that Turkey is physically on is known as Anatolia, and of course that land has been there for a very long time. Fossils of Turkey remains have been dated up to 23 million years ago, but of course the birds weren't being called turkeys then, neither was the country. The name Turkey since the 1300s has been used to refer to the land of the Turks, and there doesn't seem to be a definitive explanation as to where the name Turk comes from. It's believed to come from the Byzantine Greek Torkos, and in Persian it's believed Turk is not only the national name for the people, but also could mean a huge spectrum of things, such as a beautiful youth or a robber. For the longest time, the landmass that we now know as Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire, yet in 1923, after the fall of the empire after World War I, the Republic of Turkey was founded. So the nation of Turkey is named after the people of the land, the Turks. While we now know how the country got its name, that doesn't answer why the bird is also called a turkey. Well, the bird we all know as a turkey wasn't the first bird to be called a turkey. The guinea fowl is a bird native to East Africa and looks somewhat similar to what we know as a turkey, especially when compared to a female turkey. These guinea fowl were brought to Europe via traders and merchants from parts of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. These traders became known as turkey traders, and the guinea fowl they brought to Europe were met with a great reception as they were incredibly tasty. These guinea fowl in Europe became known as turkey cocks and turkey hens for males and females respectively, named after the nationality of the merchants who brought them to Europe, and eventually they became known as just turkeys. But of course this was the guinea fowl, not the turkey we all know. The modern turkey can be put into two categories, the wild turkey and the domestic turkey, which are both in the same species of turkey. While domestic turkeys are found all across the world, wild turkeys are indigenous to parts of the US and parts of Mexico. When Spanish settlers in the New World sailed back to Europe, they took some of these Native American birds with them. In Europe, people saw these birds and felt they looked and tasted much like the guinea fowl they call turkeys, so Europeans started calling these birds turkeys too. And if you think calling this bird a turkey despite it not actually coming from Turkey is confusing, just wait till you hear the bird's name in other languages. languages. In Turkish, the bird is called a hindi, which means from India, and in the Hindi language, the bird is called Peru, referring to it being from Peru. Of course, turkeys aren't native to India or Peru, but a lot of languages reference India in the bird's name, and a lot of languages reference Peru in the bird's name. Of course, turkey birds aren't native to these nations, yet these countries have been linked with the birds, as the Americas were also known as the Indies/West Indies at the time of them being exported to Europe, hence many languages referencing India in the bird's name. And Peru was also a part of the New World controlled by the Spanish who brought them to Europe. And it's not only India and Peru that get referenced to in the bird's name in other languages. In Gaelic languages, French is mentioned. Its Mela name literally translates to Dutch chicken, and its Breton name means Spanish chicken. Yet perhaps the most accurate names for the birds come from the languages of Native Americans. To them, the bird didn't appear from some other country. And what better represents this than the name of the bird in the Algonquin language, Miami, Illinois? In this language, it is called Naloki Piliwa, which simply means native. Many countries are named after tribes and groups of people, such as France being named after the Franks, and Finland possibly being named after the Finns tribe. So when it comes to perhaps the most famous group of people from ancient history, the Romans, you'd think the country they originated from would be called something like Romaland or Romania. But of course it isn't called anything like that, it's called Italy of all things. Yet however, there is a country to the east of Italy that is called Romania. How did we get to a point where the country that is home to the Romans isn't called Romania, but the country of Romania is? So I guess the first thing we should look into is how a country in the Balkans ended up with a name linking it to the group of people who came from the Mediterranean. Well, the name Romania derives from the Latin Romanus, meaning citizens of Rome. However, before being known as Romania, the land area that covers modern-day Romania and Moldova, as well as parts of other modern-day nations, was called Dacia, named after the tribe who lived there, the Dacians. The Dacian people were considered the fairest and most courageous of men by Herodotus, and in the 1st century BCE, the Dacian king Bulabista made the Dacian kingdom more powerful than ever. Yet of course, this was all before the Roman Empire got their hands on the land. By the 1st century CE, gold supplies were disappearing across the Roman Empire, so much so that the empire had to look outside of its borders for more. The Romans knew of Dacia before this. They knew it was a thriving society of its own, most likely with plans of conquest themselves. But when the Romans heard the Dacians were mining gold in the mountains of their land, something had to change. It was in 101 CE that Roman Emperor Trajan invaded Dacia, with the conquest being complete in 106 CE, and the area becoming known as Roman Dacia, taking on many Roman customs such as Latin, eventually becoming the Romanian language we know today, hence why we have a Romance language in a sea of Slavic speaking nations. And of course it made the name of the land shift from Dacia to Romania, as of course the Dacians were now citizens of Rome, with the name becoming official in 1866 with the Constitution of Romania. So now we know the name Romania means citizens of Rome, then why isn't Italy named this too? After all, they really are citizens of Rome too, right? Well, while the name Italy does actually come from the name of the citizens of the land, it doesn't come from the Roman citizens. The Vitali were the name of a tribe that settled in the Calabria region, the southern tip of the boot of Italy. It was originally however spelled Vitalia, thought to come from the Latin Vitalis, meaning a one-year-old calf, and the name Vitalia meaning the land of cattle, as the area was rich with cattle, with the name being used by the Romans themselves to refer to the south of the country, and then to the country as a whole, eventually changing to the name we know today, Italy. I guess Italy isn't called Romania because even the Romans didn't call it Romania, and called it Italy. These two nations of Romania and Italy might seem incredibly different, one a Mediterranean paradise and the other a Balkans fairy tale kingdom, yet there's ties between the nations, especially with their names, both named thanks to the Romans of course, and both named after their citizens, except in Romania's case, those citizens are people who invaded their land for gold, and in Italy's case, it's just the people from the south of their land. History really is written by the victors sometimes, especially as it seems with Romania's name, as while now the Roman Empire is left solely to the history books and ruins, Romania's name shows us to this very day the impact that the Roman Empire had on this world. This video wouldn't be possible without the support of all my patrons. It's just $2 a month to have your name appear here, but even just $1 a month gets you behind the scene access, your name in the video description, and helps us achieve our goal of $200 a month. Thank you to everyone who already supports me on Patreon, and thanks to all who decide to support me in the future.